if we do not make any efforts to prevent our bilateral relationship from deteriorating, Cold War might be the best result we could achieve in the near future. We need this sustaining academic exchange, antidote to growing hostility and mistrust in this difficult period.
What role does cultural exchange play in fostering better understanding between the U.S. and China?
The first remark I want to make is to President-elect Trump. Please restart the Fulbright program. I'm the Fulbrighter in 2015 to 2016 at the Science of Johns Hopkins. It is really a wonderful experience. I usually recall the events organized by the Department of State, that is a baseball match, pumpkin pickup, and the visit to the Howard University, the first university for African Americans after the Civil War. And I usually talk with my experience to my students in my course. And I once had a plan to apply for this Fulbright Scholar in Residence to teach Chinese civilization for the United States host university. Unfortunately, this program was abolished in Trump's first term. I was supposed to be here last September and end my one-year program this September. However, I got my invitation in last March, and I got my documents for C1 visa at the end of December. 9 months check, which just took me 3 days in 2008 visit. My university is in a suspicious list. I got many questions in my visa application in the Consulate General of Shenyang, but fortunately I'm here. I think today we need this sustaining academic exchange. I want to speak to Beijing and Washington's data. Even though we were enemies, we still need this sustaining academic exchange. If we stop communication, if we do not make any efforts to prevent our bilateral relationship from deteriorating, the Cold War, now we are worried about, might be the best result we could achieve in the near future.
What areas should the U.S. and China engage in more?
I like your word engage. Today, fewer people use the word engage. Confrontation and conflict became the main word to describe U.S. and China relationship. I think this engagement didn't fail. So I'm the achievement of this engagement. Because this is my third time and third year in the United States. I taught my students about what the United States really is based on my observation here, and talk with my colleagues in the United States about what China really is. So this is still a good policy for Chinese United States to engage together. I think there are plenty of areas like global health, cultural exchange. Yeah, but I think today the priority should go to two areas. One is the nuclear arm control and the non-proliferation, because the Ukraine war is a great challenge for this non-proliferation. Russia's military tie with the North Korea is both worrying and risky for this non-proliferation. And the other should go to the regional stability and the security. The potential conflict area for China and the United States are there: Taiwan, South China Sea, and the Korean Peninsula. So if we do not manage these disputes quite well, that may result in some catastrophic disaster. So how should we engage? I think the most important thing for these two parties should restart the high-level dialogue. In the Bush Jr. and the Obama years, we have this strategic and economic dialogue. So the top diplomats and the financial decision makers met regularly. Even though today it is harder and harder for them to reach agreement, even with full of, we say, the quarrel and the blames, we still need that. Because through that dialogue, we could know each other's right line instead of through guessing. And also can speak frankly our bottom line. So the misperception is the most dangerous thing in this period of distrust.
Why is sustained academic exchange between the U.S. and China important?
Today, we are in a period of the distrust. In the past few years, due to various reasons, United States students and tourists to China declined dramatically. I hope such a kind of exchange could be restored due to the joint efforts of both sides. Just a few weeks ago, United States eased the travel advisory for China. I think that's a good sign. I think we could start with the academic exchange. Scholars would bring the Beijing and Washington's voice and then bring back their response. I still remember I once had an experience. I once attended the US-China Young Leadership Dialogue in 2016 in DC. The topic is about denuclearization in Korean Peninsula. So before the session, the young scholars from both sides, we both have the doubt that whether United States and China really hope the realization of the denuclearization. After the one-day closed-door and sincere session, we re-established the trust for our effort for the denuclearization. I think our discussion would be submitted as a report to our government, and that might help us to reestablish this kind of mutual trust.
In the countryside, men still represent the stronger gender group. Women, on the other hand, are socially and economically more vulnerable. When policies are enforced, various gender disparities come to shape legal realities on the ground. In divorce lawsuits, women often walk away without any judicial remedies for domestic violence. Mothers often end up losing child custody, and there's a pretty good chance that women on the verge of divorce end up giving up their property rights.
What is a key takeaway from your research on marriage in China?
Despite repeated emphasis on gender inequality on the books, in reality, there's still tremendous gender inequality, both within and outside Chinese courts. And people sometimes expect courts to equalize men and women in society. And yet, what I learned from this project is courts, legal professions often end up doing the opposite. Instead of alleviating gender inequality in Chinese family, in society at large, courts and legal professions often end up reproducing and reinforcing power differentials and inequalities in Chinese society. So I think that's the biggest takeaway.
What do gender disparities in China's legal system look like?
If we just focus on law on the books or policies on the books, we may walk away with the impression that Chinese laws are either gender neutral, or you may even have the impression that policymakers, lawmakers have tried really hard to protect women's rights and welfare. Well, then in reality, when these laws are implemented or when policies are enforced, various gender disparities come to shape realities, legal realities on the ground. And perhaps one good example is that according to the marriage law and now the civil code, both men and women shall be equal in marriage, right? But in reality, especially when you look at court rulings in divorce lawsuits, women often walk away from divorce lawsuits without any judicial remedies for domestic violence. Mothers often end up losing child custody. And if the couple in question have joint property, there's a pretty good chance that women on the verge of divorce end up giving up their property rights. So this is where I see a huge gap between law on the books and law in action.
What is the process for getting a divorce for rural women in China?
Most of the women in my book were migrant women. So these were women hailing from the countryside and working in China's metropolitan areas for a living. And for these women, if they wanted a divorce, many first had to accumulate cash so they could fund their divorce lawsuits. So almost the very first step was to find a job, a farm job in Chinese cities, towns, and save money first, and then find a helper, usually a legal professional, a lawyer or maybe a basic level legal worker, to get a sense of how to launch a divorce lawsuit against one spouse. So that was the second step, find a legal professional. And the third step is travel all the way back to countryside. Because remember, a lot of the women work in the cities and they couldn't really go anywhere to file divorce lawsuits. They would have to go back to where their hukou were located and find a local court, file a divorce lawsuit. That's the next step. And once a court agreed to hear your case, you would have to wait until a judge could locate the whereabouts of your husband, bring two individuals into a court organized mediation or maybe adjudication. And this process could last anywhere between a few weeks or a few months, in some cases, even years, depending on what could happen along the way. So it can be very time consuming and costly. And of course, while women wait for the court system to reach a decision, a lot of them couldn't really continue their employment, right? And so this means that during that time period, they would have no income. Most of them relied on their savings for this time period. In the countryside, men still represent the stronger gender group. Women, on the other hand, are socially and economically more vulnerable than men, and in their own communities, women were usually treated as outsiders. So it was much harder for women to mobilize local communities to support their legal mobilization. So if you happen to be a victim of domestic violence, for example, it would be really hard to find a neighbor or a community leader or village cadre to testify on your behalf and prove that you did suffer from domestic violence, or maybe your husband was cheating on you. So it was much harder for women to mobilize local communities. And finally, for the local court system, judges were quite aware a lot of these raw men, once they became divorced, it would be really hard for them to find another spouse. And this in part had a lot to do with China's highly skewed sex ratio. There were just not enough marriageable women to go around. So once these husbands sever their ties with wives, it's very likely that they would remain single for the rest of their life. And judges were acutely aware of these social demographic problems. And if a man threatens to harm himself or to hurt his wife, suddenly this could become a matter of weiwen. The translation is usually stability maintenance. So judges sometimes, in order to pacify these men, they sacrifice women's property rights, custodial rights, and spousal rights in exchange for husbands' cooperation in divorce lawsuits.
How does gender equality differ in rural versus urban areas in China?
There are definitely important differences between urban and rural China. As I mentioned earlier, in the countryside, women, once they get married, they often relocate from their natal villages, natal families, to live with their husband and their in-law. They also need to change their hukou status. Natal village or natal family refers to the family, the village you were born into. The family or the village they are married into, these are conjugal family or conjugal villages. In their conjugal villages, these women are often viewed as outsiders, and that outsider status makes a much difference when you try to mobilize state law, the local court, to contest your rights. But in urban China, women don't necessarily have to relocate and join their conjugal family or conjugal village. So that's just one structural factor that can put rural women in very disadvantaged positions in litigation.
What does non-governmental assistance for rural women seeking legal help to get a divorce look like in China?
There was a noticeable absence of NGOs, civil society groups advocating for rural women. For 15 years or so, I could name one and only one organization. Initially, it was an NGO, and later it became the law firm. That was the only organization that dedicated its time, energy to help migrant women. And of course, if we're here to talk about college-educated, professional women getting together to form collective action, that's very different. So I just want to quickly separate these two scenarios. But if we're just here to talk about millions of migrant workers in China, especially migrant women, if they want to contest their rights, if they want to protect their rights as mothers, wives, and property owners, it will be really, really difficult for these women to find NGOs to help them. So I'm afraid till this day, this is still the case.
Hello， 我叫小米，然后我之前常驻北京，然后我之前是在北京吉安德工作。
大家好，我是欣欣，我之前居住在潍坊和北京，我以前在潍坊的一个艾滋病机构和北京的艾滋徒步工作。
我觉得用一个字形容的话是天翻地覆。是如果我们看20年前，可能大家都不知道什么是 LGBT， 但现在的话就是2024年UCLA 的 Williams Institute 他们发布了一个就是中国大众对于 LGBT 的公共意见的一个研究。那他们发现有 70% 的受访者都回答说他们有至少一个 LGBT 的同事、亲人、朋友在他们身边，所以可以说明这个LGBT 的这个议题对于大家来说非常熟悉。那这个社群对于中国社会来说也是非常的可见。
对，我其实很认同小米说的。当然我因为本身是从事艾滋病工作出身，在最初的中国，很多人认识 LGBT 的议题可能是和 HIV 有关的工作，是因为公共健康的问题，在那个年代这个是最紧迫的。那我相信到今天它仍然是重要的需要解决的问题。但是越来越多的变化是，越来越多的中国民众把 LGBT 的议题和艾滋病的议题分开，会对于社区有不一样的看法，除了和疾病的关联，更正面化，更去污名化。我觉得这是一个非常大的改变，像小米说的，就是一个天翻地覆，这20年来。
我记得2015年的时候有一个公共意见的研究，那当时是发现 30% 的受访者是支持同性婚姻应该得到法律保护。那2024年这个研究呢，发现有 52% 的受访者都会支持这个同性婚姻。对，所以来说这几年来说，这个进步真是非常大。
对，而且最近几年中国在司法进程改革上也有了一些进步，包括我们之前也聊过这个议定监护，虽然它不能完全替代同性婚姻的这个完全的权利，但是也能一定程度上保障同性伴侣的权利。我们也知道很多中国的律师现在正在推进这个议题，这也是一个非常好的迹象，改变的迹象。
那其实2022年就是在跨性别这个议题上来说，中国卫生部是发布了一个新的性别重置手术的一个规范。那原来要做一个性别重置手术有很多很多的门槛，但现在尤其是说一个就是跨性别者必须要达到22岁以上才能够做手术。那现在 就是新的规范要求只要18岁，然后获得父母的同意就可以做这个手术。所以说在这个医疗卫生领域，我觉得这个权利的进步也是相当可见的。
而且对于 LGBT 群体，在说回公共卫生领域，很多这个研究也开始更多的分化不同的 LGBT 群体，包括 gay， 包括拉拉，包括跨性别，也有更多的其他的非二元群体。我们的这个不管是卫生主管部门疾控中心，还是我们的药厂，都充分意识到了各个社区人群的不同的需求。现在很多这个跟 HIV 有关的药物的实验都越来越广泛的这个多元化在群体上，所以这也是一个非常大的一个认知上的提高，对于政府，对于民众。
其实现在我们就是中国的 LGBT 的社群当中，我们大家就是关心特别多的议题，然后在很多方面就是其实已经取得了非常就是惊人的进展，就如同我们之前所说的，不管是这个手术的规范，还是说这个更多的研究，还是说议定监护这个同性伴侣的这个权利以外，那我们还有别的这个关注的议题，包括说在工作场合中的这个平等的工作的这个权利，就是说我们可以在工作场合中不因为我们的性取向、性别认同受到歧视。那在22年，我们有一个非常重要的一个案件，就是中国的一个跨性别者起诉了当当网，因为他的这个性别身份而就是 fire 掉了他。那我们这个案件是得到了法院的支持，就是获得了胜诉。另外就是除了工作以外，我们也非常关注这个校园中的霸凌的问题。那我们也是和教育部门一直在工作，一起来倡导在这个校园中的预防对于 LGBT 学生的这个校园霸凌。
在我在潍坊工作的时候，在我在这个小城市基层社区工作的时候，我们和当地的职业学校合作，我们开展这个性教育工作。虽然这是普重性的，并不是针对某一个群体，但是我认为这特别有助于这个改善普通民众对于 LGBT 的这个社区看法，包括像刚才小米说的这个霸凌的问题。我们认为这个充分的全面的性教育能够帮助大家正确的认识 LGBT 群体，从而避免霸凌。所以我们也是一直做这个工作。那我们为什么会说从职业学校开始做呢？因为我们认为职业学校是以职业为导向，是以就业为导向。很多学生这是他们人生中最后一个阶段，在学校的阶段，所以我们认为就是这个阶段是最后能够充分全面接受性教育的一个时期，所以我们认为这个工作是非常紧迫的。
对，除此之外，我们也非常关注这个医疗的问题，就是我们一直在倡导说，作为一个 LGBT 的人士，并不意味着是一个精神病患者。那我们也一直在和利用法律、利用媒体去倡导、去传播这个理念，然后我们也一直在和有关部门一起抵制来消除这个扭转治疗。对，除此之外，我们也有很多的社群朋友特别关心同妻的问题，就是我们社群当中也一直在想办法去支持更多的同妻，让他们的这个社会问题被大家看到。其实在我们机构有很多的项目和工作其实受到了美国的同行的这样的启发，我们看到了他们的这个best practice。我觉得星星可以介绍艾滋徒步的这个情况。
我们先说一下艾滋徒步，就是艾滋徒步我们是通过一个徒步的活动为受艾滋病影响的社区来筹款。我们利用这一些筹款， 我们在中国举办一些青年领导力的培训项目，我们培养更多的这个艾滋病青年领袖，让他们回到他们的学校，回到他们当地的社区，继续影响更多的人，从而降低艾滋病的感染率，从而这个去除艾滋病的污名化。那在这个问题上，我觉得中美之间其实有非常多的相似之处。我们也的确是受到了美国很多同行的这个启发，包括这个洛杉矶同志中心和这个旧金山艾滋病基金会，他们每年都会联合举办的这个艾滋骑行。我也是非常有幸，我是这个洛杉矶同志中心的这个领导力培训项目的成员。我们也和他们的一些项目官员聊过关于在这个项目上的这些启发，还有这些合作的可能。
我们机构原来还有一个项目叫做彩虹媒体奖，那其实是受到了这个 GLAAD 的启发，就是我们的彩虹媒体奖专注于这个媒体的监测，希望说这个媒体界能够用更多元的、更包容的视角来报道这个中国的 LGBT 相关的议题和新闻。
对，说回公共卫生领域，中国是美国我们是最早受到美国总统援助艾滋病紧急基金的支持的国家之一。的确给予了我们数以万计甚至以亿计的资金，帮助中国的这个艾滋病社区度过了最艰难的时刻。这也是中国能实行4免1关怀计划，为艾滋病感染者免费提供药物非常重要的一个机会。在那个时候可能我们的经济还没有现在这么好，对，所以合作还是非常多的，而且很多领域是关键领域的合作，是拯救危机生命的。我们也认为，就是中国过去30年还是发生了就是巨大的改变，这个大家生活的条件真的是就是每天都在变好，我们相信就是未来也会更好。所以我觉得可能应该更多的就是改变过去对这个我们这个特别悲惨的生活的这个固有刻板印象。虽然我承认中国仍然有很多问题，我们还是有很多需要努力的地方，但是这不是否认我们过去工作成果的原因。对，所以我觉得应该更多正面看待就是社会的发展。当然问题我们也一直坚定的提出，我们也一直是这个提出问题的人。对，
因为我是一直在这个跨性别社区当中工作，然后我目前也是在做一些跨性别职场、跨性别的这个经济赋权的一些工作。我们现在是在搭建一个跨性别的一个职场网络，然后希望通过这个社区的支持，然后来促进跨性别社区的这个经济的发展。对，尤其是解决这个不管是工作或者说这个职业前景的这个问题。那另外一方面，我们也是在非常紧密的跟这个扭转治疗的这个议题上工作，特别是我们在和扭转治疗的幸存者一起工作。那我们去年是通过艺术家、策展人还有这个扭转治疗的幸存者，我们一起开展了第一个扭转治疗的一个艺术展览。那同时期我们也开展了一个线上的展览，来通过让艺术的作品来让大众了解扭转治疗给这些当事人带来的伤害。对，那同时我们也在为这个社区提供心理治疗和这个团体咨询。我们希望说能够创建一个安全的空间，让大家能够彼此交流和支持，然后来克服扭转治疗给他们的伤害和创伤，然后重新建立起他们的生活。那除此之外呢，我们也在通过法律的途径来就是继续倡导消除扭转治疗这个议题。那我们是和律师一起来提出一些诉讼，然后让社会公众来关注这个议题。对，
我目前主要就是负责的一些工作呢，主要就是和艾滋病有关的公共卫生议题的工作。刚才我们也聊到过，我之前一直在艾滋图部工作，我们一直有一个青年领导力的培训项目，所以我目前的主要的工作就是举办各种培训。对，我们过去1年里，我们有在中国办过1次培训。当然，过去的3年、4年可能是受到这个 COVID 的影响，可能有一些线下的培训，我们受到了一些政策上的或者是疫情上的一些影响。但是我们觉得说，现在就是 COVID 结束了，说不定可以开始更多的工作。
You're seeing universities, for instance, begin to implement policies of not having research or educational exchange with Chinese universities. Cultural exchanges are still okay, but almost any kind of meaningful engagement with China is also in the Canadian context, as in the US context over the last few years, become more and more a question.
How has Chinese migration shaped Canada and the US?
The connection to Asia and to China is primarily, at first, about goods, bringing laborers in to build the railroads in the United States, transcontinental railroads. Same thing happens in Canada, that Chinese coming by boats, ships, and landing in the major ports like Vancouver, San Francisco, and Seattle. That's why the Chinese are here. They're here to build railroads, but also serve as the labor for a lot of the industries that develop. And so that's what brings Chinese in the 19th century. They do a lot of building small businesses and bigger businesses. And so they bring a lot of economic prosperity, which leads to a lot of resentment and the scapegoating of Chinese. And so the politics of scapegoating that really arise in places like California, Oregon, Washington State in the late 19th, early 20th century is something that also marks the rise of British Columbia as the westernmost colony and then province of Canada. And so that long history of scapegoating Chinese, it's something that is like a tool in a toolbox that can be kind of pulled out when you need to blame something on someone else. And so anti-Chinese and then what became anti-Asian politics shaped the West Coast of both the United States and Canada. And you could say for both countries, this became a defining way to understand how the country organized around white supremacy. Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, they're all actually kind of white settler colonies, to use a fancy phrase, but they are all places that European migrations, people arrived and they used, certain political tools in similar ways and learned from each other. The kinds of ways in which Chinese were targeted legally. There's people actually read up and researched and said, oh, this is a good idea that they are doing in Australia. Maybe we should think about it here. And so that kind of sharing of best practices in white supremacy, sharing of policies towards China when China seemed to be a problem or an enemy. We, like the United States, were exclusive. We kept Chinese out. In the United States, the 1882 Exclusion Act, we had a head tax from 1885 to 1923. And then in 1923, we passed an Exclusion Act. So between 1923 and 1947, less than 100 Chinese were allowed in to Canada. Chinese could not vote here until 1947. If you were Chinese, it didn't matter if you were born here, you could not vote. If you've disenfranchised a set of people, you can target them with impunity. And so the big change was family unification here in the 1940s and 50s, just like in the United States. And then in 1967, we removed white supremacy from immigration policy. And so we had large numbers of non-whites come to Canada in the 1970s. And it remade a country that really had been built around white supremacy. And so there are parallels to the United States with 1965 immigration reform, allowing a lot more Asian American communities to form or reform, in the case of Chinese, both north and south of the border in North America.
What is unique about Hong Kong migration to Vancouver?
In the 1990s, there was a large number of Hong Kong Chinese who, knowing that there was going to be a reversion of political control from Britain to the People's Republic of China, many began to come in, not even large numbers, but significant enough numbers. And they came with enough money. They weren't rich. They often were middling people in Hong Kong, but they came with enough money to actually move into neighborhoods that for a long time, Chinese weren't really supposed to live in. And that's where the reaction within the press was to focus on these invasive Hong Kong Chinese who were wealthy and rich, and somehow it was inappropriate that they were moving into these neighborhoods that had actually been built around white supremacy, that had housing covenants. And similar to the United States, if you bought a house in this area, there were in the contracts that you couldn't sell to non-whites, you couldn't sell to Chinese, or you couldn't sell to indigenous people or Jews. So it was anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Asian sentiments, all wrapped into a legal contract on your house sale. And so that's very similar to what happens on the west coast of the United States at the same time. For Canada, the 1990s moment is kind of unique because we're one of the destinations, along with Australia, New Zealand, London, for many of the Hong Kong Chinese who are seeking basically a place to be. And so that's when Vancouver became world famous. And so you started to read headlines across the world, around the world, with this Honcouver, this phrase coined as like, oh my gosh, it's terrible. We've been transformed by all these Chinese who do inappropriate things like spend money that they've made somewhere else to buy property. And so the scapegoating of Chinese for unaffordable housing or for stores suddenly catering to them and no longer catering to the white customers who only speak English, signage laws began to be passed that you had to have English language signage. So that kind of racism and scapegoating, it's tied to that 1990s moment and the name Honcouver. So Canada is not some paradise. We've had a long history of anti-Asian racism and exclusion, and our ability to use that as a tool of scapegoating and of really getting people angry and blaming a set of people for broader problems. That's a history that we have had. In Canada, there's a bit more of awareness of different kinds of migrations at different times. And so the Hong Kong Chinese coming in the 1990s in large numbers had a huge impact. You say there's an awareness that Hong Kong Chinese also brought a lot of culture and good dim sum. We also brought over some of the best chefs because of our point system. Those were professionals. There's a lot of things that were shaped by moments of migrations.
What are some recent challenges that Chinese immigrants face in Canada?
I'd say one of the things that is probably important to know, but is not something that a lot of people hear about outside of Canada, is that we had a violent flaring of anti-Chinese racist attacks. That was something that occurred here in parallel with what was occurring down in the United States. There's a high awareness that in the United States, racism and racist incidents happen. It's not like racism is off the table as an explanatory mechanism for going, wow, this happened. In Canada was this need to first convince people it happened. 2020, what you saw was a lot of shock from people who thought, this doesn't happen here. I would be asked a lot, are you surprised that this has happened? And I would say, no, I'm not surprised. And that was surprising to a lot of people. If you're thinking about Canada and really the last 2 or 3 years when a recognition that China as a society might be a problem or a threat to national security in the United States or in Canada, there has been a fairly organized reaction by the intelligence agencies of what we refer to as the Five Eyes here. So Canada, Britain, United States, New Zealand, Australia, they share intelligence about the threat of China, for instance. And so what you're seeing is a recurrence, and I would say that this is very worrisome from a historian's point of view, a recurrence of a lot of the things that occurred in the 1950s with the sort of China scare and anti-communism. You're seeing universities, for instance, begin to implement policies of not having research or educational exchange with Chinese universities. Cultural exchanges are still okay, but almost any kind of meaningful engagement with China is also in the Canadian context, as in the US context over the last few years, become more and more a question. And so I think that's one of the most worrisome trends that's occurring both north and south of the border. And it's not an accident that it's occurring both north and south, because in some sense it's being organized by the same sets of people who believe that China will be the threat. The spillover onto someone like me, I am fourth generation. My great-grandfather came here, my grandfather came here, but that doesn't mean I'm protected, as are most Chinese American, Chinese Canadian, and Asian American and Asian Canadian populations, from being tied to a change in global politics. And so if China is the enemy, then anyone who could be thought of as somehow tied to China by the way you look, by the way you speak, by where you've come from, even where your great-grandparents came from. That, I think, is a pretty worrisome trend that really requires people coming together and acting. And I think in the Canadian context, what that's led to is a lot of coalitions to push back against anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism. But many of those people within those coalitions are those who experienced Islamophobia. It's others who have been targeted and understand what it's like. Japanese Canadians, just as with Japanese Americans in the United States, were very quick to see how scapegoating that had occurred to their own communities historically, how that is starting to recur. The other thing that, for me, thinking about the present moment, is it really is important to understand the historical context of the use of anti-Chinese politics, both in Canada and the United States, how they were done often historically in concert, sharing best techniques, but also the resistance to it. Chinese communities in the United States and in Canada also shared and talked about how they were hiring lawyers to challenge racist legislation, both north and south of the border, that they were aligning and forming alliances with others who understood what racism was like. I would also say there's some good things. When Canada opened up to China and recognized the People's Republic of China, and there was ping pong diplomacy and opening up, and actually that happened in Canada first. The folks who actually pioneered ping pong diplomacy, and then eventually President Nixon went and recognized China. That had occurred the year before in Canada, and it was our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, who visited China and watched ping pong matches, and we sent ping pong teams. And so culture exchange as a tool to actually build relations is something that was actually pioneered, you could say, in the early 70s by Canadian diplomats and their advisors. And so I think if there is a moment of optimism in this moment of really rising tension diplomatically and in terms of national contests between the United States and China, between Canada and China, it is that there have always been people who see that this is not actually a fruitful path, and how can we actually work together to prevent things from getting worse, or at least mitigate the worst excesses.
China is essentially looking at a $1 trillion debt repayment effort, and that too in countries which are up to their eyeballs in debt.
What were the original goals of the Belt and Road Initiative, and how have they evolved over time?
The origin story of the BRI, which started in 2013, is actually quite interesting. I would take you back a few more years before that, in 2008, 2009, when in the aftermath of the great global financial crisis that started in the US housing market, US Treasury significantly reduced their rates of return on bonds, which is when the Chinese state, which was at that time parking hundreds of billions of dollars in T-bills, decided to pull all that money out and actually look for bankable projects. So the largest year-on-year increase that we see in China's overseas development finance portfolio was around that time. This is the first time that aid data recorded Chinese development finance overseas to cross the $100 billion mark. This was in the year 2009. But then when the BRI was announced in 2013, 2014, and China went around the world trying to follow through on their leadership's promise to bring more projects, at that time, a lot of the developing countries already had their capacity to absorb debt at the maximum. So countries with smaller economies could not take on the kind of large debt that China was offering. So that's when China got innovative, and they came up with different ways to park dollars into projects and then to generate returns that could be used to fund infrastructure. This was done much like things were done within China for many years before that. So a typical project for infrastructure in a developing country would result from the creation of a joint venture or a special purpose vehicle where 10 to 20% of the value of the project would be put in the form of equity by the host country, and the rest of it would come as a loan from one of the Chinese policy banks, Exim Bank and CDB being one of them. And what that did was that it created these shell companies in the private sector backed by guarantees from the host country government, but not really on the books of developing countries. And that enabled China to bring really large infrastructure into some of the world's poorest countries. And that continued for many, many years. In fact, we see that the peak of Chinese Belt and Road development financing came in the year 2017, when in a single year, they touched almost $140 billion. But since then, it's been a steady decline in Chinese development financing from that high level of 140 billion a year to about 85 billion in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. One of the conundrums that China is facing is that despite the fact that it has committed such large volumes of development finance in all over the world, especially in low and middle income countries, when you look at Gallup World Poll data on public approval of China's leadership and compare it to the United States, they're actually facing, as of 2021, a 16 percentage point disadvantage over China. You would normally expect that as great power comes in and starts to put in projects, that its popularity among publics in recipient countries would go up. But that isn't quite happening in the way that we would expect. So what we did to analyze this further is that we divided the world into 3 or 4 categories. We divided the world into countries which are, from China's perspective, safe bets. In other words, their public opinion there is shifting more and more toward China and away from the United States. We then looked at countries which were toss-ups, either toss-ups leaning toward China or toss-ups leaning toward the United States. And then what we would call moonshot countries. These are countries which have moved more and more toward the United States camp during the first part of the BRI. And what we find is something quite interesting, which is that 2/3 of all Chinese development finance from 2018 to 2021 went into the toss-up countries, which means that China has a nervous system that is closely observing movements in public opinion toward its leadership and then adjusting its strategy to prioritize countries where they think that there is a more competitive space. And not only that, but we also find that China is quite risk averse when it comes to public relations. In countries which we would classify as being moonshots, or in other words, in the US camp, we find that only 15 or 16% of development finance money goes in there. So they know that these countries are out of their reach, and they would rather just double down in places where they know that things are going well for them, or in places where they think there is competition and they could sway public opinion toward them. I have found in ADA's research that when China faces headwinds, it tends to lay low when it comes to reputation. And when it is benefiting from tailwinds, its strategy is to double down. So take the example of Bangladesh. Bangladesh has been ruled by Sheikh Hasina, who is, for lack of a better term, an authoritarian democratically elected leader who has turned her country into a one-party state. And what we've seen is that as Sheikh Hasina has consolidated her power in Bangladesh. From the year 2009, when she came to power, until now, the size and proportion of China's development financing has shifted. In the $71 million per year range during Sheikh Hasina's first term between 2009 and 13, and today they are crossing $2.3 billion. And most of this big money is going into infrastructure projects, especially high-value infrastructure projects such as the Padma Bridge project or the Dhaka Expressway elevated project, which are really helping Sheikh Hasina's government augment its control over Bangladesh by showing the people of Bangladesh that they have this ability to deliver big-ticket infrastructure. But on the flip side, if you take the example of Zambia, where China during the Edward Lungu years from 2016 to 2018 was giving out about $3 billion worth of development financing every year when they had found a like-minded development partner. But then as soon as the IMF started to push the alarm buttons and say that the debt to GDP ratio of Zambia had crossed 100% and that the debt situation was rapidly becoming unsustainable, China really backed out in a big way. So much so that by September of 2018, when Zambia formally signed on to the BRI, China had stopped all new commitments until all the way to 2020 in November, when Zambia, of course, defaulted on its sovereign debt. So it's very obvious that when things are not going so well from a reputational perspective, when they're being blamed for things not going so well, their instinct and their strategy is to check out of a country. And they do the exact opposite in places where they are finding like-minded, stable democratic leaders or authoritarian leaders who are willing to conduct development financing projects much in the same way as China has done at home.
How is China addressing poor environmental protection standards in the early Belt and Road projects?
So if you're looking at a portfolio of China's BRI projects at the moment, you will see a lot of flashing red lights. And these flashing red lights indicating problems are not just because of the debt issues that are talked about quite often. They are also related to what I would call the performance of the portfolios. So let me put it this way. In the year 2000, if you looked at the portfolio of China's overseas development financing projects, you would only find 17 projects worth $450 million as having environmental, social, or governance problems. Today, when you fast forward it, you will find that there are 1,700 projects worth $450 billion with a B that have environmental, social, or governance problems. Put it another way, the proportion of Chinese projects that have these problems has gone up from 12% to 53%. So this is really posing a significant crisis on the part of the Chinese authorities to make sure that they can reform the way that they're going about doing projects. And we have seen that since 2018, there's been a series of guidelines being issued for BRI projects to follow environmental standards. And when we compare the environmental standards in an average Belt and Road project today as compared to 10 years or even 5 years ago, we see a big difference. Chinese state-owned companies, together with state-owned banks, and in partnership with their syndicate partners, many times they are not even Chinese entities, they have significantly improved the quality of what we would call ESG safeguards in their projects, which means that in an average project, when we compare the terms that they're offering, they are comparable to a World Bank or an IFC loan much more than they were in the past. And what I mean by that is that they are imposing stricter environmental protection standards. They are requiring environmental assessment plans to be made. There is very clear rules and regulations about how to protect workers and indigenous communities. And that has really been quite a remarkable improvement in China's portfolio. In the year 2021, which is the last year data releases its data, we find that 60% of the portfolio benefits from higher quality environmental, social, and governance safeguards as compared to less than 15 or 20% only a decade ago.
How has the United States responded to the BRI, and how have global opinions of the BRI changed since it was launched in 2013?
The United States and its allies have launched a series of what they call alternatives to the BRI, which means that they are going to switch from primarily being providers of aid or 0% interest loans to, for social spending, to entities that will be providing loans for large infrastructure, much like China does. So a prominent example of that is the US Development Finance Corporation, whose budgets have just in the early years of the Biden administration gone up 15 times. So the DFC is now going around the world and putting out loans such as the big Colombo port project with India's Ambani Group in Sri Lanka, in which they are basically saying that we will do higher quality infrastructure which has better ESG protections and therefore better sustainability outcomes. The challenge that the United States and its allies in Europe are facing is that China is not only outpacing them by giving more dollars for these projects, but China also has the ability to deliver projects in a record time. So if you compare A grade or highest quality World Bank project with an average project in the Belt and Road, we find that it takes on average 6.5 years for a project to get to commencement when it comes to the World Bank. But in our data set at 8 Data, we are finding that China is able to deliver infrastructure projects on average in 3.5 years, which means that if you are a host country government leader in a democracy in Africa, for example, you know that signing a deal with a Chinese bank would guarantee you almost that you would receive the project before the next election. Whereas if you sign it with the World Bank, it might mean waiting for your predecessor to reap the benefits of that. So in that way, the speed and the scale, China has a major advantage over the value proposition that the United States and its allies is bringing on the table.
What is the future of the BRI?
We are already seeing that the composition of financing coming out of China has changed. I'll give you a simple example of that. So in the heyday of the BRI, I would say 2015, 16, something like 2/3 of all development financing was going toward infrastructure projects like big power plants and bridges and tunnels. That has come down to about 31% by 2021. And what has gone up by the same token is what we would call emergency lending, which means that as countries are having trouble repaying the loans that they had taken from China 10 years or 5 years or 8 years ago, the Chinese system is using other instruments such as the central bank and the State Agency for Foreign Exchange Management, SAFE, to give short-term liquidity injections to some of their largest borrowers. In other words, the right hand is paying money to take care of loans that the left hand was supposed to receive. And that has created a cycle which is really masking the great debt crisis that we are facing in the world. 8 Data's data shows that something like 80% of China's portfolio is now in countries which are in debt distress. And much of this portfolio, I would say about 70% of this, will be up for repayment by the year 2030. So China is essentially looking at a $1 trillion debt repayment effort, and that too in countries which are up to their eyeballs in debt. All of this means, in my view, that in the coming years, we will see a lot of conversations about debt restructuring, debt reprofiling, or short-term liquidity injections of this variety that I was talking about earlier. Without doing this, I just don't see any credible way in which all of that infrastructure could be taken care of by way of repayments in the way that they had imagined originally. So I would say there's going to be a lot of controversy and a lot of conversation about how China will deal with the debt crisis. And some of the early indications from cases like Zambia and Sri Lanka is that China is choosing to reschedule debt on its own term in a bilateral fashion. They are not really coordinating with the Paris Club or other big creditors from G7 countries. And we will have to see what that behavior will be in the future and how it plays out in the next 5 to 10 years.
We have yet to release any kind of binding legislation or regulation on generative AI. And that leaves a lot of ambiguity, both for users and for companies in the US. And Silicon Valley companies are taking advantage of that ambiguity for sure.
What are the key differences in how the US and China handle court cases relating to AI?
The way that AI disputes are playing out in Chinese and American courts is, I think, really indicative of the broader global debates about AI, what it's going to be, that it might destroy us, that it might make everything better. These are the large so-called hype narratives that are coming from CEOs like Sam Altman, who are very much playing into the goal of attaining AGI, what they call artificial general intelligence, which is going to save us from cancer and climate change or kill us. And we just got to kind of roll those dice. So those are the grand narratives that are the backdrop of very in the now present issues concerning specifically intellectual property and the way that it was used to train AI generated products such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, but also a bunch of other generative AI tools that exist in China as well. And then also on the flip side, the way that users can or cannot attain intellectual property rights for creations that they make using these generative AI tools. So what I like about intellectual property as an issue to focus on is that it both grounds us in what's happening right now, when so much of the discourse on AI is future oriented and cannot be empirically backed per se, and also has tons of challenges in terms of compute capacity, climate change repercussions, and other concerns that many people are doing the great work of pointing out regularly. And it really situates us in the present and focuses on harms that writers and other content creators are hoping to have addressed in terms of how their work was used to train the models. And also for artists and creators who are looking to use these tools now, but want to have the assurance that their work will be protected. So it's really a two-sided issue. And conveniently, the Chinese and American courts are each taking on one of those sides for the most part, with US cases primarily focused on that input side. So you have big cases such as the New York Times suing OpenAI over its use of New York Times content. And, as a backdrop to that, there's other American news outlets who are making deals with big AI companies to provide consent for using that content, since they've basically calculated it's going to happen either way, because there's not a national regulation that would bar it or a law that would make it illegal. And then in China, the cases have been more focused on outputs and on intellectual property protections for users who create art and other products using generative AI tools. And basically the degree to which the human issue of creativity and modification comes in to sufficiently make a work that users, rather than just a product that was created with the AI tool. In both countries, it is content creators of various kinds who are bringing the cases. So, for example, you had the actor and comedian Sarah Silverman bring a case in the US. She was concerned about the way that her book was used and her other content was used. And in China, you have individual artists, potentially not even professional artists, but people who are creative in their own right. For example, there was a case where a user used Stable Diffusion, which is somewhat ironically a US-made tool, to create an image that he modified, put his own kind of touch on, and then he put a watermark on it to protect it. And another user on social media reposted that image without his permission and without crediting him having removed the watermark. So he brought that case forward. And so this really is rooted in individuals who are seeing how IP, lack of clarity, how ambiguity surrounding IP and AI can affect them directly right now. So again, I like that it's very grounded in current disputes and in real life interactions between humans and AI, rather than placed in this far off hypothetical narrative. To bring a case, a plaintiff needs a set of facts. A plaintiff needs to have a description of harms incurred, not potential harms that might occur in the future. There are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, in order to have a real case, you need to be able to come forward with an experience. And so far, nobody that I know of has had their life utterly saved by the concept of AGI. And on the flip side, these comparatively smaller level disputes concerning IP are happening in real life and are playing out in both the US and China. I think that one maybe side benefit from these grand narratives that CEOs enjoy in Silicon Valley and to a lesser degree in China is that comparatively, your IP does not seem very important if what we're up against is robot armies or existential threats or huge benefits for humanity, right? If that's what they're saying is on the table, then whether or not you can put a watermark on an AI generated image seems really beside the point. So that allows them to sort of get away with fast forwarding past these inconvenient issues of IP. And the two countries' legal systems are set up in ways that very distinctly can come in and play a role to try to right some of those wrongs, not necessarily in real time, but in the near future after the harms were incurred rather than in hypothetical land far, far into the future.
How are the US and China using AI tools? Do you see differences in how users or companies are developing these AI tools in different sectors?
Well, the major difference that does get a lot of airtime for good reason is AI firms in China have to confront a much more restrictive information environment. They have to operate following the existing guidelines for cyberspace that are overseen by the CAC, Cyberspace Administration of China. And they are held to a very high standard in terms of not introducing new forms of information chaos with advancements such as generative AI. So they are up against a bit more challenging of a background environment than the relative Wild West of the US, where content is king. So that's a major difference. And that has affected both users and companies. But I would say that another major difference is China's a bit faster at coming up with tech-related regulations that may or may not have a direct relationship to the censorship regime and stability maintenance more generally. But the fact of the matter is China has a data privacy law. It has clear generative AI regulations that were promulgated a year ago. We have yet to release any kind of binding legislation or regulation on generative AI. And that leaves a lot of ambiguity, both for users and for companies in the US. And Silicon Valley companies are taking advantage of that ambiguity for sure.
What are the areas for cooperation in AI between the US and China?
I like the concept of intellectual property best practice sharing as an area for potential cooperation between the US and China. I have to provide the caveat of it's potentially very unlikely, just because many things in the relationship are difficult to achieve these days. But what I like about it is sort of playing into both countries' interest in national security or securitizing the space of generative AI, making sure, for example, dangerous misinformation doesn't run rampant. It plays into that regulatory, structural, security-oriented goal, which both countries do have in very different ways. And it also is boring enough that bringing together nerdy experts in intellectual property from both countries to really work through some of the nitty-gritty issues, hopefully bringing to the table each home country's experience working IP disputes out in the courts on the input or output side, seems really possible because it's not inherently wrapped up in the issues of censorship on the Chinese side or on tech competition per se. Both countries want their people to have access to clear intellectual property rights. They want them to be able to access that despite the emergence of generative AI, even if it's just because they want to encourage the use of these products, which both countries do, because both countries want to have a very significant, sizable, powerful AI industry. Judge Ge of the Beijing Internet Court said as much in a public appearance she made at the beginning of this year, when in describing a ruling that they made that was read as quite pro-industry. She said, yeah, I mean, we want people to use these products. We want to develop the industry. That is a clear priority. We're seeing more recently signs of that. Earlier this week, the director of this CAC said publicly that development is a clear goal, that He called out intellectual property as an area that needs to be strengthened in order to foster that development, but also to maintain security in both generative AI specifically and in cyberspace more generally. So I think it's an area where there's sufficient mutual interest, and it isn't necessarily as rife with some of those background, competitive, rivalry-based issues at the core of the US-China relationship.
I have a very clear-eyed view of the strategic competition, and I don't think that there's likely to be any major change in that for some time to come. But, I think there are some particular choices that can be made in the next administration that could at least cabin that competition from spilling out into outright conflict.
What is your sense about the general interest level in China regarding the US presidential election?
I just came back from a month in China, in Beijing and Shanghai, and perhaps unsurprisingly, I found that the level of interest in the US election is incredibly high. Certainly, all of my interlocutors, whether they were academics or government officials, even ordinary people, are extremely interested in the US presidential election and following it very closely. I think that's probably would have been true under, almost any circumstance. But I think there's such a widespread understanding that US-China relations are particularly poor right now. That, I think, is part of what is driving this intense interest in the US presidential election. So just about every conversation I had over the month in China, no matter what the other topics of the conversation were, there would be some portion that was devoted to lots of questions to me about the very specific dimensions of the presidential race. And of course, it was a very dramatic month in terms of news about the race. So that just drove the questions even more.
Do you have a sense that Chinese elite or even leaders have a preference between the two candidates?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Professor Wang Jise just published a long piece in Foreign Affairs along with some colleagues speaking to this exact question. And I think in broad terms, it's clear that there are lots of different opinions. I think that the Chinese leadership is very cautious not to express a particular preference because lots of reasons, but including not wanting to be accused of, election interference. But it's very clear that there are different arguments circulating among the elites. I think a baseline perspective, which is reflected in Professor Wang Jise's Foreign Affairs piece, is an understanding that this difficult moment in US-China relations is likely to persist for the foreseeable future, that what we sometimes term the bipartisan consensus on China is likely to limit the range of policy options for the relationship for either a Republican or a Democratic administration. But then I think there's some understanding that there are some issues that can be understood to potentially be a little bit different based on the administration. I think there's an understanding that perhaps trade issues are of particular importance to Donald Trump. And so if he were to be elected president again, one could imagine a return to some of the dynamics that launched the initial US-China trade war back when he was initially president. If Kamala Harris is elected president, one would imagine that a lot of the current Biden approach will continue, and that includes, particularly working with allies, includes some effort to find spaces for cooperation on issues like climate change or public health, and maybe some steps towards continuing to strengthen the dynamics of people-to-people exchange. We've just heard that Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, is going to be on the ticket. And it's clear that Governor Walz has some history that is quite unique on the questions of student and people-to-people exchange generally. So one could imagine that there would be a little bit more room for that in a Harris administration. But these, I think, in many ways are on the margins. I think the main thrust of U.S. policy towards China will be more or less in the same zone under either a Trump or a Harris presidency. And I think even though these are questions that are probably hotly debated within Chinese elite circles, I think on the whole, there's an understanding of that.
To what extent do you think China will be a live issue in the upcoming election?
Yeah, one of the things that I was a little bit surprised by was in that first presidential debate between a then candidate, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. China didn't really come up that much. I think it only was mentioned in passing a couple of times. I was a little surprised by that, to be honest, because of how much China has been a political issue in recent years. But on reflection, I think that is some indication that, more or less the two parties have a similar broad approach to China. And there are so many ways in which the Biden administration has continued the policies of the Trump administration in terms of tariffs, in terms of concern over, issues like Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan. There's not a lot of room there for there to be real political argument. And so I think that was interesting. I think it was interesting that did not come up in that presidential debate. And of course, there's still many months before the election and that could change, but as of right now, my guess is that other issues, more domestic issues, will be more front and center in this election than the China issue in particular.
What do you perceive as the differences between these two candidates and China? And would you maybe expect a different policy approach to China based on which candidate wins?
Yeah, I think, I sort of telegraphed my own views a little bit in my earlier response, talking about the views of, Chinese elites who are following this. And I think more or less, I also have the view that, the broad contours of U.S. policy towards China are not going to be that different. I think the main variables that could lead to some difference would be perhaps the emphasis of a new Trump administration on trade issues, or conversely, the interest that a Harris administration might have on human rights issues. Also, the interest that a Harris administration, perhaps informed by the experience and perspective of Vice President, if he's elected, Tim Walz, would have on people-to-people exchange and student exchange. Yes, also the question of allies would seem to be one that a Harris administration following up on the Biden administration would put more energy and investment into. And these perhaps are significant. It does seem to me, though, that they are more on the margins of the wider U.S.-China competition framework, which built up over the last couple of administrations, at least, and I think is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. Yeah, I think, in some ways, maybe my perspective for those who are hoping for some improvement in U.S.-China relations sounds like a pessimistic one. I do think it's a realistic one. I have a very clear-eyed view of the strategic competition, and I don't think that there's likely to be any major change in that for some time to come. But, I think there are some particular choices that can be made in the next administration that could at least cabin that competition from spilling out into outright conflict. And then there's some choices that could be made that could preserve some space for some cooperative dynamics, again, maybe in the realm of people-to-people exchange broadly, but also maybe specifically on shared global challenges like climate and public health. I would be interested, regardless of which administration takes power in January 2025, I would be interested to see if they are open to exploring some of those possibilities for cooperative dynamics, even though the wider landscape is clearly going to be one of strategic competition for the foreseeable future.
we need to get students, we need to get people, academics, we need to get business people, and even just tourists. We need to get more of them in China, seeing it firsthand, and also meeting Chinese people and getting to know them and getting to ask them questions about their culture. That's very, very important.
How did your interest in China start?
So I think I'm kind of a student of the 60s, or someone who grew up in the 60s. So for me, at that time, there was a lot of interest in Eastern mysticism. Alan Watts, if you know who he is, was pretty famous. His books were good introductions to Eastern mysticism. And I was interested in Zen Buddhism and Chinese in general, just because for cultural reasons. It was a nice sort of counterculture way of looking at the world. But the first time I had a sort of a close-up look at Chinese culture was my parents were very generous and nice people, and they made the acquaintance of two Taiwanese women in the Oklahoma City area that we were living in, who were struggling to find a cheap place to live. And so my parents let them stay in our house, when I was in high school. So we had two Taiwanese women living in my house, and I had a great deal of fun with them, learning about Chinese culture. And they taught me my first Chinese. But the first Chinese I ever learned was not ni hao. It was 吃不讨不吐不讨皮, 不吃葡萄倒吐不讨皮. They taught me a tongue twister. That was the first Chinese words I ever learned, was a tongue twister. So from then on, I just became self-taught in Chinese and was mostly interested in the language, not yet so much in the culture. I just thought the language was so fascinating. And I discovered Orville Schell. I don't know if you must know who he is. His first big book, In the People's Republic, was an incredible introduction to China at that time, the current China that he was reporting on. And it was a kind of an introductory lesson to concepts like the Danwei system and Lei Feng and collectivism and all the aspects that we know about China back then. But my involvement in China really started in about 1986, when a friend of mine, Douglas Hofstadter at Bloomington, where I was going to music school, had written a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach that won a Pulitzer Prize. And he found out from his colleagues that his book was being translated at Peking University by a team of translators. And he really was picky about his translation of his books, because it's a very complex book with lots of wordplay. So he basically ordered me, you're going to Beijing and take part in the translation team and make sure they're not botching my translation, because he really was concerned about that. So with that as my beginning, I ended up at Peking University in 1986, taking part in a translation of a book. And from then on, I just got hooked on both the language and the culture. And this was the 改革开放 era, right? And as a foreigner, I could see that something truly amazing was going to happen at that point. And those of us who were there were certainly right. And from then on, it was me just kind of going with the incredible flow of change and evolution that was happening at the time. So that's how I got interested in China.
How have you seen China evolve over the decades?
Yeah, this is a good question, but there's so many ways to talk about it. There's the economy and the basic mindset of the people, their familiarity. But I think for me, I started from this 改革开放, the reform and opening period. And during that period, the Chinese were extremely intensely curious about the West, and especially the US. And every day or every week, it seemed like there was something new, like, oh, China now has Coca-Cola. China now has rock and roll. China now has McDonald's. Now it has cars, and now it has soccer, and so on. So for me at that time, Chinese were intensely interested in the West, and had many questions for me, and had many misunderstandings about the West and the US. So the difference between now and then is night and day, because nowadays, we have 300,000 students just in America alone, learning at our various universities. And we have generations of diaspora who have already immigrated to Western countries in the US. So if anything, now the asymmetry in understanding is on our part, not theirs. I would say they know much more about the US than we know about China. And I would dare say even someone like me, who's been in China for 35 years, I still think they still know more about my country than I know about theirs for various reasons. And maybe China is just so complex and has changed so fast. There's so much to learn. But so there was that. And also back then, there was a kind of an inferiority complex. So if you praised China, they would say, oh, no, we're horrible compared to you. China, the West is so great. And they were in a period of learning. There was Deng Xiaoping's phrase of "Tao Guang Yang Hui," bide your time and build your energy or your ability. So at that time there was also a kind of an inferiority complex about their culture. They felt we need to be learning from the West. We need to be learning how to make money, to build businesses and economies. I remember going to a bookstore at the Peking University campus, and I wanted to get a copy of the Taoist classic, the Tao Te Ching, and they told me, no, we don't have that book. And I said, what? A Chinese bookstore that doesn't have the Tao Te Ching? And the clerk told me, who's interested in that stuff nowadays? Which was true. I mean, they were all interested in money and finance, and who's going to read the Taoist classics, right? So that's also changed. They've now rediscovered their own country. They have pride in it. Their culture, they are very invested in it. And so it's really kind of a huge shift from being sort of in the dark, excluded, outside, to be a part of the global culture and to be very proud of their own culture and proud of their own the nation as a geopolitical player. They're also very proud of. So I was glad to see that. I witnessed that, and it had to happen, and it was an amazing thing. And that, to me, that would be the main difference.
What is one thing you wish Americans understood about China?
This is one of those questions where there's lots of different answers. I think the one aspect that I think that people need to know about in other countries, and also because it's something that the Chinese government kind of adds to the misimpression, because they try to promote the notion that China is very unified as a nation. That is, despite all the ethnic minorities and the generational differences and the rural-urban divide, that China is basically, of one mind, of one mission, very much behind the party, and they're very unified in their politics and their way of. That's not quite right. If you go to China, you realize they are a very diverse country. The government wants to give you a sense that there's a consensus and a unity, but actually it's very diverse. There are very few opinion polls, and there isn't the vote. So that we don't, the range of opinion and the range of orientations is a little bit opaque, or maybe even invisible, because you can't see it. We don't often get a glimpse of diversity of public opinion, but there are really people on all sides of the political spectrum if you're here. These opinions are usually expressed privately, or in moments of lapses, or when there's a trust that's been developed. But if you ask the average Chinese, for approval ratings for the government, they will give you a pretty positive one based on the economic conditions, on the fact that the party has brought so many people out of poverty, and they have a sense of this optimism that they're doing better than their parents did, and their children will probably do better than they are. Although that's kind of eroding these days, just as it is in other countries as well. But I think what I would alert people to is that China does not think with one unified mission or one unified worldview. There are as many different opinions at different levels and areas of education, as I say, rural versus urban, and people who are sort of live in a more porous society where they're able to go abroad and come back again. They have a very different view about things. So yes, don't believe it when people tell you China is all, that thinks as one massive social human brain. They are really diverse in every way, including ethnically, religiously, philosophically, and politically. That's why we need to get more people here like you. We need to get students, we need to get people, academics, we need to get business people, and even just tourists. We need to get more of them in China, seeing it firsthand, and also meeting Chinese people and getting to know them and getting to ask them questions about their culture. That's very, very important. So China is geopolitically so significant now that you can't ignore it. It's kind of duh. Obviously, this is the place to go because it's a very important country. But I think there's also some other reasons that have to do with the humanities and also just sociology, cultural studies. is that China is probably the most complex and powerful example of a culture that developed relatively or virtually independent from the West. We look to our forebears as from Greece and Rome, and these societies and cultures are, sort of molded our own society today, our education and our politics and so forth. As such, China is a kind of an important test case and a contrast to this cultural background. It's an alternative discourse world, you could say. China's culture has different views about human nature, about human beings, humans and the relationship between the two. It's a relatively secular, humanistic culture, which has, is greatly different from some of the Western countries, as particularly the United States. It has different ways of looking at governing the people. It has very different philosophy about harmony, cooperation, how to build a culture and a people who can work together as one. Very less of emphasis on the personal and individualist and more on collectivist ways of doing things. And a different starting off point for ethics overall. And just in general, just a challenge to our Western notions and perceptions. It shows us that there is another way to be and another way to envision human society and what the goal of human society is.
Why is learning the Chinese language important today?
You wouldn't believe how many articles and how much in academia, and especially Chinese pedagogy, that debates are now underway, not only with the translation apps, but the AI programs that we now have that are, equally sort of, intruding into the way we usually taught Chinese and the way of teaching Chinese language. So I'm right in the middle of that, and I'm part of that. And I think overall, basically, we shouldn't be afraid of these apps, and I don't think that we should fear that it's going to make learning foreign languages go away, or that it's going to make us all so lazy that we no longer learn Chinese. I don't think that's going to happen. If used right, these apps can be a great boon to especially Chinese language users, because Chinese language, as you probably know, has a very high bar, a very high threshold in learning that has to do a lot with the characters. You don't just pick up Chinese in 1 or 2 years like you might pick up French by spending a couple summers there. You've got to really dedicate a huge portion of your life for many years before you can get some level of fluency. Nowadays, that's not quite so normal. But then, so why is it important that we actually learn Chinese to be able to really speak it without the apps and the digital tools? The reason is that despite all these ways that you can sort of cheat, and I hesitate to use that term, but in a way, you can do a lot of things you couldn't do before with zero Chinese. But I think what we shouldn't forget is that the human aspect, the one-on-one, direct contact with human beings, has not lost its importance in all this. If anything, it's become more important since we're so addicted to Zoom calls like this, where we're not really in the same place, but at least we could see each other and look each other in the eye. But the actual being in the same place, seeing the same sights, smelling the same smells, experiencing the same joy or sorrow, whatever it is that's happening, in the cultural context, that is so important that we should use these apps in a smart way to just make us get to that goal of fluency and able to communicate as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. So I think the apps and the digital tools don't really change the basic priorities, which is still one-to-one communication in one-to-one contact. And I'm a linguist, and I never lose sight of the fact that the core of language is not script or grammar or pronunciation. Well, it is pronunciation, but script or reading or texts or Bibles and things like that. The core of language is speech, is communicating speech. So much human communication took place long before we even had writing systems. So this is still the core value, the core function of speech is to bond and communicate with human beings. So I think now that in this age when we're flying all over the place and we have all these internet tools and things, now more than ever, we need to keep reasserting that priority, because that's where the consensus building and the peace building and the mutual understanding come from, really, is from talks with people in rooms, face to face.
What can both countries' governments do to help foster genuine, authentic cultural exchange in your field?
I think for my field, it basically comes down to contact, in that you need to have, people need to be brought together, and the governments can often help that happen. But at that point, the governments have to step back and let things run their course. I mean, for example, my engagement with China began with the Peace Corps. So this was the United States government sending me to a small city in China and teaching. But once I was there, they basically left me alone, and I was, in the Chinese system, and I was teaching Chinese students, and then later I wrote about that place. And so it was important to have the initial government support, but it was also important to have the freedom to make my own conclusions about that experience and to lead my own life there. And actually, when I finished that experience and started writing my first book, Rivertown, about that, when it was about to be published, I heard that the Peace Corps, some people in the Peace Corps weren't happy that I'd written about it, and they were afraid that it might jeopardize their program. And my take on it at that time was, well, this is my experience, and I have the right to write about it, and I wasn't going to ask for permission. And so that's the thing that governments can't do, is they can't control the narrative. They can't create the narrative. We have this idea of control the narrative, and governments like to pretend they can do that. But in truth, it's a very individual process. You can bring the individuals together, but you can't shape their conclusions. That's what makes it natural. That's what allows writers to connect with readers, is that sort of authenticity.
How can literature help improve cultural understanding between the United States and China?
Yeah, I mean, there is an incredibly long history of, the importance of writers in bridging this gap between China and the U.S. And really, I think in one of the earlier phases of U.S. and China engaging with each other, like in the early 20th century, you can see a lot of writers who were moving back and forth between these cultures. There was a Chinese writer named Lin Yutang, who wrote a number of books in English, helping Americans kind of think about Chinese civilization, Chinese culture. And he also brought stuff from America to China, like actually the word for humor, youmo, that they use in Chinese. He coined that to try to explain to Chinese what this concept of humor was, as it was seen in America and the West, and sort of the philosophical implications of it. Another classic example is Pearl Esbach, right? I mean, who wrote The Good Earth. And that book had an enormous impact on people in the United States seeing Chinese as individuals and seeing them as something other than sort of the other. And actually that book, probably most scholars think that it had an impact on the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. So these books can have real impact. And I happen to be in China. I went to China in 1996 and was there for 11 years. In that sort of period in the 90s and the 2000s, there were many, many writers and journalists from America who were able to go to China, have access, get to know certain subjects, certain individuals, and write those stories, and in all different kinds of ways, and introduce them to readers in America. It was a very important moment. I do worry that now we're at a different phase. It's very hard, especially for Americans and for foreigners, to go to China and to have the kind of access, to have the kind of contact that helps you understand people's stories and introduce them, to other cultures. So, I hope that that's something that can change.
The trade war has been really detrimental to U.S.-China relations, no doubt about that.
What impact do these tariffs have on Chinese competitors?
I think it's important to think about trade is inherently cooperative in some ways, right? For every seller, there's a willing buyer that is not being coerced, right? And so firms are both each other's competitors, but also each other's customers. And in a world of global value chains, I think we have to think about sort of the net impact of the trade war in terms of why this is important is that not too long ago, right, more than half, now it's a little bit less than that, but more than half of exports coming out of China are generated by foreign invested enterprises, right? So foreign investors, including some American companies, are there making things in China. And the way that we tabulate trade is about which port things come out of. So if you have an American company that makes something in China, that's going to contribute to the trade statistics, right? Think about the iPhone, right? The iPhone does final assembly in China. It sources inputs from all over the supply chain in Asia, famously designed in California, right? Assembled in China. Well, when that's exported, that accounts for the total sort of a high value of Chinese exports, but a relatively small share of value added. So, okay, on the eve of the trade war, 40% of exports coming out of China are by foreign invested enterprises. And I have a paper where we do a case study of Caterpillar, the farm equipment manufacturer, big presence in China. They had a factory that made tractors in China and exported the tractors and the machine parts here into the US. As a consequence of the trade war, that factory was shut down, but the net presence of Caterpillar in China increased. They had other assembly lines come online, and they were focusing more on product lines for the China market. I think that's pretty common for a lot of the firms. Fundamentally are the units that are involved, right, in global value chains and are impacted by tariffs. And so the behavior of how this is impacting firms, beginning with the foreign multinational firms, is not necessarily straightforward, right? So I have another paper with Samantha Worthrams showing sort of what the net impact of tariffs are on foreign invested enterprises moving production out of China. You know, tariffs are touted as bringing jobs and manufacturing back to the US, right? So we want to look at, is this happening? And essentially we find that the targeted effect of tariffs, so the industries and firms that were most likely to be impacted by tariffs, there was only maybe a marginal effect of increased rates of exits, but you had this big, broad effect, we call a blunt effect, where political risk in China really elevates as a result of the trade war. And again, this hurts small, medium companies. We find companies that have less experience, less length of operating, time in China the most. And the channel that this sort of happens through is that, right, with the onset of the trade war and the uncertainty of economic conditions, right, you have costs that are unrelated to tariffs, right? Increasing cost of financing, insurance, compliance, and so forth. And so that results in basically the entrenched players in China that are there increasingly producing for the China market staying there and continuing that practice. But it's going to discourage on the margins, right? Companies that are, unable to absorb those sort of additional costs unintended, right? There's not this easy sort of wholesale raise tariffs. Why don't these companies just come back to the to the US type of reshoring happening as a consequence? That's for the multinational companies that are in China. Tariffs are also definitely bad for domestic Chinese manufacturers. Research is very clear. There's reduced employment in that sector. There's people who look at like nightlight, satellite photography to see less industrial activity in areas where exporters are concentrated. And the impact on the Chinese manufacturing sector is equally mixed, right? You have probably some large number that just go out of business. And then you have increasingly those that have the capacity or some interest already. You see a relocation of production and of sometimes wholesale supply chains to Southeast Asia and to Mexico to circumvent tariffs. And so, a lot of times these are, Chinese sort of companies that are making, let's say, textiles or batteries or some intermediate goods, and under some pressure already from rising labor costs. And so they'll move, especially if their sort of upstream foreign partners are also relocating. So you see some of that happening. You also see, I think, clever ways in which Chinese companies are emerging to take advantage of sort of the opportunity created by tariffs, right, which makes imported things more expensive for US retailers. So if you import something in a container ship, usually that's pretty easy to tax at the port of entry. Tariffs are levied on whatever that is coming in, electronics, textiles, what have you. But if you ship something directly, there's a thing called the de minimis rule, which is basically if you ship items below a certain dollar value, and it's a pretty high dollar value now, I think it's like $800 or something like that. Well, you don't have to pay tariffs because it's just normal sort of course of selling, shipping things in the mail. Well, my wife is a fan of Temu and AliExpress, right? So Temu and AliExpress sell a lot of stuff in the US direct to consumers, and they skip this, put stuff on container ships, ship it to Walmart, and have it be retailed that way. They're just having people go online, ordering on an app, and then mailing things directly from China to the US. And so those things are not covered by tariffs, right? So you have all these different kinds of ways that companies are responding to tariffs in China, whether it be foreign invested companies or wholly owned Chinese companies. I think that that angle is a little bit, that distinction is not so important. It's size that's the big driver there. And then finally, politically, I think we do see changes happening as well in terms of policy, right? So on the one hand, China has reduced tariffs for a bunch of trade partners that's not the U.S., especially in Southeast Asia through RCEP, and it's pushing for trade liberalization as the U.S. is sort of closing markets to allies and partners. That's a big sort of response. At the same time, China is investing a lot in at least the idea of greater technological self-sufficiency in response to the sort of tech war side of this trade conflict or economic competition. So you have a little bit of import substitution happening, right? Things that high-tech goods that they used to be sourced in the US that they're not sure they're going to be able to get in the long run. They're trying to do domestically. They are trying to strengthen trade relationships outside of the US, increasing outside of the EU as well in the emerging markets. And so all of these ways, right, at the state level and the firm level, that this is impacting China. But to return to sort of the spirit of your question, right, because of the complex nature of how trade actually works, it's really hard to say, right, whether like the US or China is winning the trade war. I think in aggregate, they're losing. Both are losing, or at least both consumers in both the US and China are losing out, and some businesses are suffering, but others are benefiting and are winning sort of in this new landscape. And so I think the frame of, the political frame that we hear the most often in the news at the national level is not the appropriate one to really understand how the trade war is impacting, especially citizens, right, 老百姓 in China and citizens here in the US.
How are tariffs currently impacting US-China relations?
The trade war has been really detrimental to US-China relations, no doubt about that. But interestingly enough, I think tariffs are how the trade war started, but tariffs themselves are not so central to policymakers in Beijing and Washington in kind of a surprising way. I think, for example, right, if neither leader mentioned tariffs at all in the APEC summit and the public statements that they were making. I think President Xi talked a little bit about the importance of the WTO and sort of obliquely hinted at the fact that China, opposes imposition of security issues on trade, right? So that's talking about tariffs, but not but kind of indirectly. There are other things that I think that both sides care a lot more about on this economic competition front, especially when it comes to technologies, choke point technologies, and so forth. I think that's both interesting and regrettable. It's sort of interesting because the aggregate economic costs of tariffs are definitely the greatest on both countries, but they're not politically salient, I think, because the costs are so diffuse and the political backlash has been relatively limited. Both governments have been very successful in framing tariffs and economic competition through a lens of economic nationalism rather than through protectionism, right? You don't hear tariffs being discussed as well. They're basically taxes on some Americans to help other American, businesses or industries, right? Or in China, same thing, right? Some companies are benefiting, some are being harmed. No, they're instead being framed as the US needs tariffs to win and recapture manufacturing from China, and China needs these tariffs to stand tough against the US, and we're going to replace critical kind of components, reduce dependency on the US or whatever. And so, so far, at least, that political narrative, I think, has been working in that tariffs are not really high up on political issues that average people in the US or China care about. But I think, as we've said, right, they have real costs on households in aggregate, and businesses and consumers are sort of suffering in the trenches of this trade war. And, it's become this war of attrition, right, in that we're continuing to pay these costs, but very little movement is actually observed on the political goals that these tariffs were supposed to accomplish in the first place. And I think that's a regrettable sort of new normal that we're in right now. And I worry that, especially as the election season approach here in the US, and both parties have embraced a pro-tariff because it's tough on China platform, that we're adding this dimension of an economic security dilemma on top of the existing sort of classic security dilemma that already exists in US-China relations, right? The idea of the security dilemma is things that you take, actions that you take that are meant to be defensive are perceived as threatening by the adversary, and then they take actions that then you perceive as threatening, and so you have to take more defensive measures. So we have people have written about this a lot in the security realm. When it comes to arms sales, for example, across the Taiwan Strait, we have a new dimension now that's the economic one that's feeding in some ways into the security one. It's being justified in national security terms. That is, I think, deeply destabilizing because, not too long ago, right, 10 years ago, trade and investment was supposed to be a ballast in the US-China relationship, right? It's an area of mutual benefit, right? Trade is no longer seen as doing that by, I think, at least the rhetoric of both political parties here in the US. And I think that is, potentially dangerous and destabilizing from a strategic perspective. And I think that's regrettable from a domestic politics perspective, because it means that average citizens are paying the costs of essentially a forever trade war, and they're not getting very much in return. And so I think things will continue to get worse, unfortunately, until and unless average people start paying attention to this issue, actually look at the data, look at the facts, and question some of these prevailing political narratives here about what tariffs are supposed to be doing. And I'm hoping that the work that my lab is doing here at KU is going to contribute a little bit towards that end goal. It's been estimated that an average U.S. household is paying an average of $900 more as a result of these new tariffs per year.
What is the history of the trade war between the US and China?
I think to understand the origins of the current trade war, we have to go back to the opening and reform era when trade between the US and China was much less, right? So in 1990, it was about $6 billion of trade. The Chinese economy was smaller than Canada or Spain at the time. And there was a first round of trade conflicts in this period. And I think I want to characterize this era as a unilateral era of trade conflicts, right? So what is a trade war, right? Trade wars are when states escalate trade barriers to make it more difficult for goods from the other country to reach their market. Usually they're motivated by some perceived unfairness, some policies that are seen as hindering trade. So in the 1990s, the US initiated a wave of anti-dumping actions on China over things like IP infringement and state subsidies. And so that perceived threat to market access for China was one of the big motivators for why Chinese leaders wanted to negotiate for WTO accession. So that brings us to kind of the second era of trade relations, right? China exceeds the WTO in 2001. Steep tariff cuts, regulatory overhauls, commitments to strengthen IP protection. And so while problems persist, trade expands dramatically. The political salience of willingness to restrict trade goes down somewhat. And that continues until 2009 after the global financial crisis. So you see a resurgence of trade actions under the Obama administration, narrow tariffs on tires, for example. Anti-dumping goes up. There's concerns about currency manipulation, renewed worries about subsidies and so forth. But it was not until the election of President Trump and a few years into the administration, the launch of the Section 301 investigations, and which sort of laid the intellectual groundwork for the trade war, that things get very heated once again and politicized, right? So the approach to trade conflicts was in the Obama administration was relatively narrow and low political salience. By contrast, President Trump sort of campaigns on the unfairness of the trade deficit and jobs going to China and so forth. And so you see a high profile sort of major escalation of these tariffs that eventually resulted in 4 rounds of tariff hikes, and majority of goods that China exports to the US are covered, especially for intermediate goods. China retaliates to these rounds of tariffs by imposing tariffs of their own on US exports. And so average tariff levels go up, 7-fold in a few years, and they've remained elevated at that level. There was a brief truce, let's call it, a sort of a ceasefire in 2019 that was negotiated, where there was some hope that no new tariffs will be put into place, and then maybe they'll ratchet down the existing tariffs that are in place. But then the COVID-19 pandemic hits, trade and supply chains become even more fraught. I think here in the US and across much of the West, there's a lot of anxiety about the reliance on foreign suppliers for a lot of essential goods. There's a greater emphasis in China on self-reliance as well. So you have this spiral. And so the long story short, tariffs have remained in place. They've not gone away under the Biden administration. And in fact, the Biden administration is announcing a fresh round of Section 301 investigations, focusing on steel and aluminum, proposing a threefold increase of tariffs on this area. You have President Trump, who's running against President Biden in November, I think promising around the world sort of tariffs, and then 60% tariffs on China. So tariffs are going to be pretty big, I think, in this upcoming presidential elections.
Why has the US implemented tariffs against China?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that the motives behind the trade war in 2018, right, the outbreak of the trade war, I think there were mixed political motives that were involved, even for the Trump administration. I've written about this. And I think there are at least three sort of distinct motivations advanced by different members of the Trump administration. They see tariffs as achieving very different things. So first, there were folks who, the more traditional people who work in trade policy, I think, including Ambassador Lighthizer at the USTR, viewed tariffs as a means to achieve leverage, right? So especially the threat of tariffs. And so the Section 301 investigations were about, a bunch of things that China was doing that the US doesn't like. High among that is support for these made in China 2025 industries, seen as distorting the playing field, market access for American companies and so forth. So, the threat of tariffs was meant to get China to change its policies, right, for some parts of the administration. Others in the administration, I think President Trump especially, is in this camp, and I think why tariffs have popularity in Congress as well is considerations about the trade deficit. So President Trump has been obsessed with trade deficits since the 1980s. Trade conflict with Japan, and with China, and the idea is, he thinks that it's bad for U.S. foreign policy that China exports a lot more goods and services to the U.S. than the U.S. gets to export, and so the threat of tariffs is meant to reverse that, right? And that's popular, I think, electorally, politically, because every member of Congress would like their people in their district to be able to sell a lot of things to China, and nobody wants competition of imports, putting pressure on their manufacturers. So there's that component. That's a different logic than using tariffs as leverage, right? That's a protectionist logic where it's if we can make it so the U.S. gets to export more and we take in less from China, that's a good sort of political thing. And then there's, I think, a national security consideration as well, that was present in the Trump administration and actually sort of expanded and I think now dominates the conversation, which is a belief that trade, whatever the redistributive consequences, right, is a national security concern because it is helping China grow, helping maybe the Chinese military acquire technologies, that it's not about who gets to benefit from trade, right, as the previous two are, right? It's about having less trade with China would be better. Why are we helping an adversary by transferring sort of wealth and technology and so forth? And so the trade war is a means to just contain sort of China or attrition, put pressure on the Chinese economy so that it does worse economically. Now, these are distinct sort of, I think, motives because they have very different end goals in mind. There's a really wonderful book by Davis and Wei and Wall Street Journal journalists, Superpower Showdown, that give the blow by blow of the trade negotiation process. But I think it translated into a log rolling of demands, right? I think it seemed very clear in retrospect that the Trump administration didn't prioritize between these kind of goals and different end states, and they just sort of made a maximalist demand of like, well, can you address like all of these concerns that we have, right? And I think that contributed to the failure of the early rounds of negotiations, where I think many people were optimistic that a trade war would be too costly, it would never break out, and the Chinese, right, when shown toughness, will make some concessions. And I think the historical record shows that China was close and they were willing to give sort of some concessions, but the the book sort of shows that at some point they were like, well, what if, this is sort of too much of an ask, right? And we can't give it now because what if they, salami slice and ask more later? And so you have a hardening sort of a political will on both sides. And as a result, right, you don't get the kind of achievement that the negotiators would have liked to get, because with different end goals in mind, right, if you were willing to perhaps make some concessions in terms of reforms, if tariffs are used as leverage only, right, if tariffs are being used as punishment and the idea is to, perceived to be, the end goal is perceived to be some sort of economic or technological containment, then concessions are a sign of weakness. And so, right, how do you balance sort of those different motives? And so as a result, I think the lack of clarity or prioritization about these different end goals result in a maximalist kind of demand and a bargaining failure. From a economic and I think strategic perspective, it's best to threaten tariffs, right, and exercise that leverage and then get the concessions without actually having to implement those things and suffer the economic costs. And I think both sides expected the other to fold and ended up with piling on rounds and rounds of tariffs on each other. And I think, that's essentially sort of where we're at today. And it's surprising in a way because I remember very clearly when I began working on this, conventional wisdom was very clear that trade war probably not going to happen. Both sides should see that it's not in their interest, right? And it would be perceived as so bad for the economy and therefore bad politically. And how far we've come from that and normalized these economic costs is surprising.
How have tariffs impacted the United States?
Yeah, this is an easy one. Tariffs are bad for U.S. consumers, but they are good for U.S. producers that are competing with those imports, right? That's sort of how tariffs and protectionism works, right? But the harm in aggregate definitely outweighs the benefits, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the same politically, right, into reducing them. So anecdotally, how do tariffs hurt consumers? Well, tariffs are taxes levied at the border on imports, and so they basically make goods more expensive. A lot of this is indirect because the tariffs are on inputs of things that are manufactured here in the US. But some of it is directly on consumer items. Anecdotally, I bought a house and was starting my job here at KU right in the middle of the trade war in 2019 and faced some sticker shock for furniture, right? A lot of furniture is exported from China, so there were higher prices and low stocks. There were items that were available on the catalog that were literally sitting on ships because of uncertainty over what the tariff rates are. And so either the retailer or the exporter was kind of uncertain sort of about when things are going to go into market. That's one type of product that's imported. You scale that across sort of a large number of products and you get sort of a sense of the cost. And it's been estimated that an average US household is paying an average of $900 more as a result of these new tariffs per year in aggregate, right? So distributed across all the things that you buy that are either imported from China or have a component that's imported from China. If you think about sort of how this works on the US economy as a whole, putting tariffs on steel, as the Biden administration is proposing to do, is going to help steel workers, maybe the steel labor union employed in that industry would be happy with less competition. But it means that it's going to make the users of steel in the US, so automakers, the construction industry, make steel more expensive and costs will increase for those producers. Similarly, tariffs on Chinese solar panels, right, are going to help a couple of US solar panel makers gain a larger market share perhaps, but unit costs for US made solar panels are 50% more expensive than Chinese competitors in the same sort of level of quality. And so as a result, your US solar installers and maybe households that are trying to get solar panels on their roofs are going to pay a higher cost, and that might delay the green transition, right? So that's the balancing act that's involved. It helps some sectors of the economy, it hurts others. Another problem I think with tariffs is that they don't change the underlying competitiveness, let's say, of the US steel industry. I grew up in Pittsburgh. You just drive to Braddock and you can see the dilapidated state, the aging sort of equipment in the US Steel Edgar Thomson works there. And there's a tremendous need for injection of capital to update sort of the equipment and so forth to be able to compete against Chinese steelmakers on cost. Now, tariffs, I think, will reduce the incentive to either consolidate or need for investment because it'll it's a little bit of a lifeline for these industries that are not able to compete without government support. But it doesn't change the nature, right? It's not giving support directly to the industry. And research by Cato has shown that there's no change in the employment in the steel industry after the Trump era. Steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed, and they argue that there's been a loss of jobs in the manufacturing sector as a whole, right, for all these users of steel products. So that's a problem, right? So it doesn't, it may protect sort of a sector of the economy by reducing foreign competition, but that reduction of competition doesn't change the underlying competitiveness of the sector. And finally, I think tariffs help lawyers and lobbyists. And so, I have friends who are lawyers, so that's nice for those folks, right? But the opacity of the tariff exclusion process has created a record levels of lobbying in Washington, D.C. And there's been work, including work that I've done, that shows that this helps large players that, right, there's a fixed cost to lobbying, right? So if you already have the means to influence, if you have a large law firm in D.C. on retainer, that could help you. You might be able to navigate sort of this process and might be excluded from, paying for some of these tariffs. But it's going to hurt small and medium enterprises that don't have that capacity or know how to do it that previously wouldn't need to, right? They can just source from wherever is globally competitive. Now they have to face, right, this additional hurdle. And so tariffs, in short, right, it has a bunch of these redistributive consequences, and then in aggregate, right, it's creating costs for both consumers and businesses, especially on small and medium-sized businesses here in the US.
How has China's role as an international peace broker evolved?
Well, Elena, that's a great question. And I think I'll answer that by kind of pointing to three major trends or observations. The first one is that as China has become much more assertive on the global stage, especially with the ascension of Xi Jinping to the chairmanship of the Chinese Communist Party, so too has it become much more involved as an international conflict mediator. A lot of observers and pundits usually point to Xi Jinping's April 2022 announcement of the Global Security Initiative as a key moment. And the PRC Ministry of Foreign Affairs followed up that April 2022 announcement with a 2023 concept paper, which is really quite a critical document, I think, well worth reading for members of the audience. And among other things, that concept paper really stressed this idea that major countries, and here I'm quoting from it, must uphold justice, fulfill their due responsibilities, support consultation on an equal footing, and facilitate talks for peace. Which leads me to my second point, which is that the Global Security Initiative is important proof. It's not the only proof, but certainly a key piece of proof that China views conflict mediation as a key responsibility of great powers. And China, of course, sees itself as a great power in the 21st century. Now, it's important to note at the same time that the Global Security Initiative doesn't exactly mark a revolutionary or completely new phase within Chinese foreign policy. A lot of the themes that have long characterized China's foreign policy actually make their way into the concept paper. So, for example, the Chinese government has long stressed the need for the peaceful resolution of differences and the associated principle of non-intervention. And these principles, of course, are manifested in the concept paper. But certainly, the point here is that the Global Security Initiative is evidence that China understands its responsibilities as a global power in a certain way. And the point that I'll close on is that I think it's quite important not to overstate China's capabilities as a mediator. China is still kind of coming off a huge diplomatic win. In March of 2023, Iranian and Saudi security officials met in Beijing to sign a deal to restore full diplomatic relations and to reactivate a 2001 security cooperation agreement. And that is a big win for the PRC. But when you dig into the history a little bit, it's clear that China was able to build off of long-standing regional efforts to get Saudi Arabia and Iran talking again. And my point here is that there are some doubts as to whether China will meet with similar success, a similar extent of success as a peace broker with regards to the Israel-Hamas war and with regards to the Russo-Ukrainian war.
What is China's motivation to become a peace broker or mediator? And what are the potential benefits of taking this type of position?
Right. Well, I'll start kind of with the 360-degree view, the bird's eye view. At the broadest level, China would like to be seen as a responsible stakeholder within the international system. So there's a lot of debate as to the kind of role that China sees for itself within the international system. There are multiple scholars and politicians who argue that China really is a spoiler, which means that China wants to completely disrupt and destroy the existing international legal system. And then there are scholars who argue that China is much keener to actually work within that system, even if it would like to change certain rules to better suit its own needs. And I definitely fall within the latter camp. I see many examples of China working within the current international system, even as it seeks to mold it to its advantage. And the point here really is that China does want to cast itself as a peace broker, as a responsible stakeholder, and have the United States be viewed by many countries, particularly in the global South, as a warmonger. And if it succeeds in putting forward that narrative, then it will be more immune, I think this is the calculation, to American and Western criticism at the United Nations and at other international fora. Now, the reason why I think this is a complicated question is because we do need to be granular. So in addition to China being wanting to be viewed rather as a responsible stakeholder, China is also pursuing much more discrete security and economic interests with respect to the various regions in which it is acting as an international peace broker. So it's really important, I think, to ground our discussion in some area-specific examples. So let's maybe turn to China's ongoing mediation efforts in the Middle East, its efforts, of course, to broker a peace to the Israel-Hamas war. There's no doubt here, right, that in addition to wanting to be viewed as a responsible stakeholder, China does want to protect its extensive economic interests in the region and to assert and build and assure a climate of peace such that it can continue to deepen economic relations with countries across the region. And then if we turn to Europe and the Russo-Ukrainian war, China faces a complex balancing act here too, and has some very specific regional interests. It continues to support President Putin's regime, particularly by allowing for the export of non-lethal dual-use aid to Russia. China has an interest, of course, in ensuring that Putin remains in power in Russia and that the regime doesn't collapse there. That would be bad for China's interests. But at the same time, it isn't that simple. And China has an interest in maintaining close economic ties with Western and Central Europe. Thus, Beijing understands that the direct provision of lethal military aid, so here we're talking artillery shells, artillery, tanks, guns, not just inputs, would likely lead to the widespread imposition of sanctions. So I think the bottom line here is that it's important to take a look at how China is acting before the United Nations, but also to keep in mind some very specific foreign policy interests that China may have with regards to a specific conflict.
How does China's position on global conflicts impact its emerging role as an international peace broker?
I think the answer is that it's a little bit of a paradox, okay? That's the short answer. China has stated positions when it comes to international law, when it comes to international humanitarian law, that contrast sharply with its application of those principles to specific conflicts. Okay, so let me explain that. China has articulated overarching principles on international law that I think most states within the UN system agree with. Not all of them, of course, but let's go to maybe some principles that I think are firmly rooted within the United Nations Charter and within international law more broadly. A deep respect, for example, for the territorial sovereignty of all countries. Now, China phrases this in a number of ways, right? The inviolability of a country's geography, of a country's territory, rather, and the principle of non-interference. Now, I think many countries would agree with at least certain formulations of these principles, but the point is that while China has been consistent in paying lip service to these principles, it hasn't always been consistent about their application to discrete conflicts. So if we stick that with that example of respect for territorial sovereignty, let's just think about how it applies to the Russo-Ukrainian war, right? And the point here is that it doesn't really apply too cleanly, because while China may pay lip service to this principle, it has been conspicuously silent on whether Russia should retain occupied territory, such as Crimea, which rightfully belongs to Ukraine under international law. So there's a little bit of a paradox there. I should add that, this obtains with many countries, right? Many countries have certain wonderful values that they profess to in their diplomacy and their speeches before the UN, but may not always follow up fully with those principles in the implementation of their foreign policy.
Why should American politicians pay attention to China's global influence as a peacemaker and negotiator?
I think this is a good question to end on, particularly with US-China relations being where they are, which is to say, despite a slight warming of ties, things overall, I think, still look bleak on many levels. I'll answer again with kind of three observations. The first one is that the United States and China may be able to work together to achieve the peace. Okay, they may share certain common interests. There's a tendency today, certainly, to view China as an existential threat to the United States and as the United States' major competitor. And that may be true in most, if not many, domains of the bilateral relationship. But international relations doesn't always have to be a zero-sum game. And I think here, when the objective is the achievement of peace, the United States may find that it shares certain interests with China when it comes to conflict mediation. This might be rather less possible in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war, but does remain quite possible, I think, in the context of the Israel-Hamas war. The possibility, of course, I'm referring to is this idea that there may be a sharp confluence of interests between the two great powers. The second point is, so I already brought up the point earlier that I think we need to be careful not to overstate Chinese capabilities in mediation. At the same time, I think we need to be important not to understate American capabilities in mediation. The United States has chalked up major mediation wins in recent years, and the prime example of this, of course, is the 2020 Abraham Accords, through which the United States facilitated the normalization of diplomatic ties between Israel on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. And that was a major win by the Trump administration. And the Biden administration is now trying to build on the Trump administration's successes by pursuing the normalization of diplomatic ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, that would be difficult. That would be a coup. And of course, the Israel-Hamas war deeply impacts the ability to pursue that normalization of ties. But that's a little bit besides my point. The point is that in talking about China's mediation successes, we need to be clear-eyed about America's abilities too. And the last point that I'll share, particularly as we start to think about the next presidential election, is that continued American leadership on the world stage is important. Otherwise, China may be able to seize upon U.S. inaction. There's no doubt that U.S. absence on the world stage or ambivalence towards international institutions will accrue to China's benefit, allow China to have much more input into what the international order looks like in the 21st century, and in certain examples, certain situations, actually allow China to, quote unquote, win the peace. To give One narrow particular example, it's an example that I've kind of long thought about. The United States remains the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping budget, and that's a good thing. It's as it should be. But when you look at its contribution of personnel, there's a sharp contrast between what China contributes and what the United States contributes. So as of February 2024, China has about 1870, so just under 2,000 personnel deployed on UN peacekeeping operations or involved in UN peacekeeping operations, whereas the US contributes only 27. That's not a lot. And so the bottom line assessment here is that America needs to continue to exercise its leadership capability on the world stage when it comes to international peace, while also seeking to work with China when interests align.
Are we truly addressing data security issues, or are we inadvertently discriminating against China-based companies or Chinese citizen-owned companies in the name of national security? These are questions we have to ask ourselves. Are we solving the problems, or are we creating new problems?
What factors make Chinese companies succeed or fail in U.S. markets?
Over the years, due to fierce competition in the domestic Chinese consumer market, Chinese technology companies have become incredibly competitive and innovative. Their ability to innovate and cater to mass consumers, or even create new consumer habits, is impressive. Their secret sauce of success also wins them global markets if done right. This is why you see companies like Shein and TikTok doing well. While Shein doesn't really sell to the Chinese domestic market, they have excelled in supply chain consolidation and efficiency. This is based on decades of Chinese garment manufacturing and export experience. Now, while we see some success of those companies, many have failed, mostly due to poor adaptation to local markets. Many Chinese technology companies are so used to Chinese markets that they have a difficult time adjusting to other market users' behavior. What makes them successful may not work in non-Chinese markets. So for example, product market fit and user experience are key elements for success, but very few Chinese practices can be directly exported to non-Chinese markets. In other words, many haven't learned the hard lesson of localization well. So I've seen many trying to go abroad, or in Chinese is called 出海, but not many have been as successful as TikTok and Shein.
Why are Chinese tech companies entering the U.S. subject to increased scrutiny?
Well, there are many reasons. In earlier days, simply not abiding by regulations or laws when they enter the U.S. market, such as intellectual property, was a major dispute between the US and China. That's how Huawei was embroiled in US legal cases early on before it was viewed as a commercial espionage case. And more recently, due to the advancement of technology in almost every sector of consumers' daily lives, as well as the ambiguous relationship between business and government in China, meaning the government's ultimate control over business and society, the concern over protecting American user data privacy has been elevated to national security. This was how TikTok first got caught in the crossfire during the Trump administration. This is currently the most prevalent argument against Chinese technology companies in the US consumer market. From e-commerce like Shein, Temu, dating app, Grindr, autonomous vehicles, and healthcare equipments to the building of public transportation, etc. The possibility of the Beijing government accessing and abusing large amounts of American consumer data collected by the Chinese technology companies becomes a major national security concern. Then there are concerns over advanced technology such as AI facial recognition being used to aid the Beijing government's suppression of dissenting voices, including alleged human rights abuses of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This is why AI companies like SenseTime, MegV, and Hikvision are on the US entity list, meaning anyone doing business with them will require the US government's approval. And in the case of TikTok, Because it's an influential social media platform, increasingly a source of news and information, how and whether its algorithm is designed to influence opinions and disseminate information has become a focus. This is the broader conversation of disinformation and misinformation. But more fundamental to TikTok's problem is its parent ownership with ByteDance, which is headquartered in China. So whether the Beijing government has influence over TikTok's algorithm, which implies how information is disseminated to influence American users, becomes a foreign interference issue. And of course, we cannot deny that there's competition between China-based companies and US-based companies. The US lobbying efforts that went in to prevent Chinese competitors in the name of national security or anything else are not insignificant.
How can Chinese companies in the US build trust with the public and with government regulators?
First of all, being a good company that offers products and services that consumers can trust is fundamental to any business in any market. This applies to American and Chinese companies. And second, be humble and create value. Entering a new market is not just about dominating consumers with your products. What values are you adding to the consumers, the market, and society that can shield you from any potential criticism? China-based companies are less experienced in thinking about business relationship with society and with the government. They tend to be laser focused on business operations and execution. This is because of the stage of their economic and business development. China didn't really have a market economy until just about 30 years ago. And the rapid growth of business and commerce in the last 20 years was largely to fulfill the basic needs of Chinese consumers. When you have such a large middle class like China's 700 million people, businesses are just busy creating products to fulfill their basic needs. But as basic needs are met, products need to provide additional value. This is what I would call the soft power and social value of business. China-based businesses are doing better today as the Chinese economy is gradually transitioning from quantity to quality-based growth models, and consumers also want different products and services. China-based businesses need to remember when entering a new market is even more important to arm yourself with soft power and the right social values and impact beyond simply selling a product or a service. Now, at this point, I'm not really sure how much national security concerns can be mitigated easily because of the fundamental distrust between Chinese and US governments. However, whether a China-based company will become a target of the media, US Congress, or for the US government to take action against you is a totally different matter. This is largely about whether your products are good, whether you abide by US rules and regulations, whether you have the trust of American consumers, and whether you have done enough stakeholder engagement so the regulators, the media, the unions, or the competitors won't complain about you. In other words, you cannot make any mistakes and you have to hold yourself to higher standards.
What policies are needed in the US to better address data security concerns?
I'm not really sure if we could entirely address the data security concerns through regulations or policies alone, because the US distrust is in the Beijing government and its alleged control over China-based companies. And this distrust is not wrong because of the opaque nature of the Chinese government. It is possible, to my knowledge, however, to have controlled access and to minimize data sharing between the US and China by setting up separate data centers, using different clouds, and limiting permissible employee access by their nationality. But do companies want to go down that path given the cost? And is this the kind of approach we're advocating for if we want to foster business innovation and competitiveness? It is an important question as we try to balance national security and business competitiveness. Interestingly, we're seeing China-based companies setting up subsidiaries in Singapore or elsewhere, or Chinese owners changing their citizenship to avoid being viewed as Chinese. In that case, are we truly addressing data security issues? Or are we inadvertently discriminating against China-based companies or Chinese citizen-owned companies in the name of national security? Again, these are questions we have to ask ourselves. Are we solving the problems or are we creating new problems? Is it better or worse for American competitiveness? Lastly, the lack of knowledge about China-based companies and how they operate, as well as their relationship with the Chinese government, needs to be much better understood here in the United States. There's this mystery and all kinds of imagination about China, about the Chinese government, and about Chinese businesses, largely due to insufficient understanding. And this lack of understanding could lead to wrong policy solutions and be counterproductive to our objectives. And the only way to dispel the mystery around anything China is through increasing exchanges between our people, business, and society.
China's the third most biodiverse nation in the world. I don't think I've ever met someone who knew that. And I think those people are quite surprised. And so I think there's this misconception of one, people don't really know what China has as far as natural and wildlife resources. And so they don't know what is at stake to lose.
What stands out to you about China's natural landscape?
Yeah, quite a few things stand out to me when we think about China's nature. I think one of the first things is just how biodiverse it is, both in terms of species, but also different biomes and ecosystems. The most recent data we have, this is December 2023, ranks China as the third most biodiverse nation in the world. That's behind Brazil and Indonesia. So people don't really think about that, and nor did I. But so there's just such incredible biodiversity there. And so when I got there, I was so surprised by just how much I didn't know and how much was not taught to me, both as a student in the United States, studying Chinese and environmental policy, but also as a student in China at Peking University. There was never really a mention of a lot of these protected areas or wilderness areas of China that make 42% of China's landmass. And that's basically half of China is wilderness. And yet I think when we think of imagery and visuals of China, we think of Guilin, or we think of urban areas, Shanghai, Beijing, or beautiful places like Suzhou with rivers, but we don't really think of the wild. And so there seemed to be this strange gap in perception where there is so many wild resources out there, and yet people don't know about it. And so when I got out there, I think it was just really curious to suddenly have these experiences opened up to me. And my first year in China was a student in Beijing, and the Taihang Mountains, just west of Beijing, blew my mind. They were so beautiful. And yet, I'd never heard that even associated with the word Beijing. And yet, a couple hours drive away in the fall, it looked like kind of the Appalachia. It was just absolutely incredible. And that was kind of the beginning of my curiosity towards what I call the other side of China.
What's your favorite place to travel in China?
So this book answers, I think, your question in the best of ways. It has the English name, The Grand Hengguan Mountains, Exploring Sichuan, Yunnan, and Tibet. Who wrote it is actually a great question, because it's actually a collective of authors from the Chinese outdoors community who have basically submitted their photos and stories of exploration in China throughout the years, right? So you have all these pages of authors. I'm in there, yay. And, you have all these, it's just this is it. I mean, if you doubt it, well, then, look at, I don't know, you can just, and mine is in here somewhere, and there's a second edition coming out now that you can get. But I have a map in this book, and the Hengguan Mountains was originally started my career, and it's basically one of the most biodiverse regions in China, and it's basically, if you can think about the Himalaya, it goes east-west. This is some geography really quick. The Himalaya goes east-west, right? You have India crashing into Asia, subcontinent. You have the Tibetan Plateau rises. But then it meets the Tarim Basin, which is a lot harder and denser part of the Earth's crust. And it kind of curves and starts to go north-south. And the Hengguan Mountains, you have also the three parallel rivers, which is a UNESCO, wildlife hotspot. It's this north-south parallel mountain range that basically covers Yunnan, Sichuan, and Qinghai, a little bit of Gansu, I guess, too. And it's just beautiful. So this is the map of the Hengduan. Sorry, we're getting really nerdy here. But yes, I don't know. I love maps, and I think again, this is a part of the China that like no one talked about. So here are the Hengduan Mountains in Chinese. I don't know if it's probably off the frame, but anyways, where's my favorite place to travel in China? Anywhere on this map.
What are some common misconceptions Americans have about Chinese environmentalism?
I think a common misconception is kind of what we talked about in the beginning. One, when I say China's the third most biodiverse nation in the world, I don't think I've ever met someone who like knew that. And I think people are quite surprised. And so I think there's this misconception of one, like people don't really know what China has as far as natural and wildlife resources. And so they don't know what is at stake to lose. You know, in 2013, 2012, in that era, we were in like the smog apocalypse era. And I think that kind of took most people's attention, and pollution, right? Smog, you know, soil pollution, river pollution. And I don't think that the natural parts of China that weren't kind of unspoiled or were still quite pristine ever got the necessary attention. And that's really important, I think, because if you don't know what is at stake to lose, you're kind of going to devalue the entire country. And you're going to also, I think, reduce curiosity, right? I think if people don't know there's 42% wilderness or know there's these wildlife, they're never going to think about, oh, I'm going to go to Beijing and instead of studying international relations or politics, I want to study conservation. I want to like work between US and China in the environment field, right? That's not even going to be on people's minds. But I think we need people to really kind of like understand how valuable China's wildlife and is for the world. And again, like to put this in perspective, climate change, right, is one of the number one issues on our mind, and U.S.-China climate cooperation. But more and more we're seeing the data and science point to that biodiversity is key for nature as operating as a healthy carbon sink. And it's one of the biggest carbon sinks we have. And it can even be things like, you know, ungulates, which are hoofed mammals, so yaks in the Tibetan Plateau, trampling permafrost to keep it from melting, right? So wildlife is essential, not just in like the way we think of, oh, biodiversity is good, snow leopards are great, but when you have an intact ecosystem that's also going to sequester more carbon, we're all going to come out ahead.
What are some ways that attitudes towards conservation differ or are the same between the US and China?
I think one of the interesting parts when you think about conservation between the US and China is, you know, the US is much more developed, China a developing country. So you could say in China that a lot of it is so wrapped up in local economics and poverty alleviation. But also you could say in the US that a lot of conservation is wrapped up in economics, right? When you think about wolves and their impact on ranchers and cattle, right? That's really a fundamental question of impacting people's livelihoods. And the same can be said then for China on restricting people going up into the mountains to poach or take, you know, vegetables or Chinese medicine from the mountains, right? It all deals with people's livelihoods. It's just kind of a different culture, different scale. Another one of the differences that is quite interesting is land ownership. Well, ranchers will have privately owned land. You know, in China, you have government land, you also have collectively owned land, but a lot of it then, you know, you don't really have private land or it's leased from the government. And so that really also kind of changes the way people think about their land and their relationship with nature. In the United States, a lot of conservationists are ranchers and they are hunters who are kind of encouraged to preserve a piece of land so that you preserve a population of wildlife so that you can hunt. I mean, it's kind of a contradiction, but a lot of conservation policy has been driven by that. In China, you know, you have this kind of more strict policy of they build a nature reserve, they have a core zone of the nature reserve, and nobody except for researchers and rangers can go into that core zone. In the United States, we have national parks, we have backcountry passes, so they manage the number of people who are using the outdoors as a resource, but you can still go in and visit these areas. Think about in COVID, the US national parks were overwhelmed by tourism. Well, China has 4 times the population and about the same times of land mass. So how to manage access to nature, you want to make it equitable, but you have 4 times the amount of people who may want to go. And that's going to be quite an interesting conundrum when we think about how to manage conservation and wild land access.
Are there opportunities to explore off the beaten track in China?
Great question. So the Chinese outdoors community is really fascinating. You definitely do have this majority block of people who are really kind of like maybe day trippers and there to, you know, go walk on the concrete path, look at the site, take the selfie, like post it to their social media and leave. And it's this very structured, very like guided, like here's the fence, do not go over, like look at the site and leave experience of nature. But when I arrived in China in 2014, there was this switch going on, and it was this time where they were starting to, like, their independent groups starting to plan like national long distance hiking trails like the Appalachian and PCT in the United States. And the outdoor industry was really starting to like boom. And this is, I think, also quite underreported, but there are so many Chinese people like really pushing exploration in crazy ways across China. And I go back to my prop, yay! So, oh yeah, here we are. So I think like this is my story, and Qinghai, there's my tent and nice lake. We were probably the first people to ever camp here and like take photos of this area. And so, yeah, it was, so just stuff like that, where honestly, to some degree, it feels a bit more wild than New Zealand and the United States, because the industries are so mature here that they kind of have to manage people in the backcountry by limiting the numbers and saying there are designated camping sites. In China, there's really no management system for that. So you have like, yes, you have like places like Jiuzhaigo or Avatar Mountains, and it's like go here only. But then you have all this other wild, unregulated landscape that you can just walk and just go. Their problems with that is that, you know, if that opportunity does not line up with the knowledge of leave no trace, for example, and best practices outdoors where people are throwing trash, they're, you know, not digging holes when they go to the bathroom outside, they're camping too close to waterways, then you have a lot of like damage to the ecosystem, and trash is a big problem. And because of trash, some areas have actually been shut down to access. But in general, I think that like the Chinese outdoors community is awesome, and they do so much. Again, it's all in Mandarin, so it kind of like flies under the radar, but there's so much going on, and it is like so exciting to see like this emergence of this like new relationship with nature and exploration. Yeah.
Is there a desire for legislation to manage wild places better in China?
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's definitely a desire from this kind of like a little bit more fringe, more hardcore outdoors community for example, when they're planning these national through trails, what they really need is permission from the government to maybe like put up some signs or like do some markers on the trails like we have in the Appalachian Trail, etc. But the government right now, a lot of the local governments, they're really encouraged to basically look at, you know, their local economy and what's going to bring in the most tourism dollars, etc., etc. So if they can't make the business case for it, they're not going to get legislation or a lot of government support for these. Now, you could also look at places like Siguniangshan, the Four Sisters Mountains, which has like completely commercialized climbing 17,000-foot peaks, you know, and like people are flying in from Shanghai on a 3-day weekend and like climbing these peaks that make Colorado look like a joke. Now, of course, there has been like deaths with it because they come in too fast, they don't acclimatize, and so there is this like kind of push and pull of the government wanting to prioritize ecotourism dollars in the outdoor industry, like asking for certain things, but it can be done too quickly or at too large a scale, and that has problems associated with it. But eco-education, nature tourism has gone on the rise. We see the national parks that have been built so far. We don't see like backcountry experience, like we do not see like unregulated, like free-form outdoors experience being encouraged, but we do see like, let's go on a tour with this wildlife expert and we're going to observe birds, or we're going to learn like what the wildlife or the, you know, the flora is in this area. And so that kind of eco-education is very, very positive. And yeah, we'll see where it goes.
What are developing areas of environmental collaboration between the US and China?
I think one of the interesting things that I'm watching right now with the environment is, you know, in 2021, China announced the establishment of its first 5 national parks. A lot of those parks were based off of the US model. We were the first nation to create the national park idea. And before COVID, there were a lot of actually visits between the national park administrations of each country. The Paulson Institute was doing great work on that front. And actually, you know, when was last November, I think 2023, when the pandas were leaving DC and all the news was kind of going on about that, what they didn't report is that there was actually a group of Chinese officials from the new Giant Panda National Park visiting national parks in the US at the same time, which is kind of a good news in that sense, but it wasn't really reported. But collaboration is actually going on there, and the National Parks Department from the United States has been very proactive in getting that going. So I think that's, and China's planned 44 more national parks to be announced, but they're in the plans. I think that area of collaboration and cooperation is going to be really interesting and hopefully really beneficial. And then right now I'm working on my own project called the China Outdoors and Conservation Network, and we're basically logging attempting to log for the first time all of China's local grassroots conservation groups and NGOs, where they work, their project sites, and how people can get involved. Both if you're Chinese, you want to volunteer, or if you're just, a person over here and want to know more about them. And we're kind of like geotagging where they work by ecosystem, by species, so that eventually you could go online, you could kind of search like, okay, I'm interested in China, I'm interested in, waterways, or I'm interested in high altitude habitats or forest habitats or mammals, and then we could kind of spit out, here are the groups that are working in that area.
How has music connected African Americans and China over the last century?
My research starts at the beginning of the 20th century, so I can really start there. In the mid-20s, African-American jazz musicians, particularly from the West Coast of the US, started going to Shanghai to play in the very opulent ballrooms that they had there. And they discovered that there was a great market for that music. The musicians who win, or some of the top musicians, I would say, in the world. So some of the musicians coming out of Seattle, for example, were a part of the first Black music union in the country. And so some of them were from Garfield, the very famous Garfield High School. And they were very astute, very steeped in not only the classical tradition, but very good at jazz. They were there at the beginning of jazz. So they were extremely great musicians. They find that there's some good work in Shanghai. And when they get there, they take over the music industry in that sense, because there's no one who's playing like them. There are other, jazz bands of musicians, working in Shanghai at the time, Filipino musicians, Japanese musicians, even Chinese musicians, right? But of course, the African-American musicians were very steep. This was their music. Jazz was their music, and it was taking the world by storm, right? Jazz music was one of the first global pop music in the world. So, and these were, the inventors. So you had people like Teddy Weatherford, who played with Louis Armstrong in Chicago in the early 1920s. So you had and so the impact that it had on China was that Chinese musicians and musicians from around the world could sit and listen and learn from these jazz musicians. And a lot of them did, right? Whether that was going to the clubs where they were playing, some of them couldn't go there, right? Or whether it was watching Hollywood movies, because Hollywood movies were one of the first talkies, Check and Double Check, featured Duke Ellington and his band in the movie, right? So even if some of these musicians, because of the racial hierarchy and imperialism, colonialism of the day, couldn't attend some of these opulent ballrooms, they could still hear the music at movie theaters, where they did actually notate some of this music, right? We do have interviews from Chinese musicians who know for a fact that these musicians from the 20s and the 30s were like going into the movie theater and notating the jazz that they were hearing and trying to go back and play that in their nightclubs. But you also had African-American musicians who were playing in Chinese clubs, and there they had to cater to the local taste. And so they were learning how to play Chinese folk music, and they were sort of jazzifying that. And it worked really well because these folk musics were based on the pentatonic scale, and jazz does quite well with the pentatonic scale, because it's also based on, the blues and a folk music. So these musicians learned very quickly how to integrate Chinese folk music into their style of music. And that had a huge impact on the music scene there. Of course, jazz doesn't get to be played in China for a long period, because when the Communist Party comes into power in 1949, by 1954, they've basically shut down all these clubs and cabarets, and it becomes illegal to play jazz, to own jazz, to have the records, to have the instruments, right? It's vilified as the old order. So essentially, jazz is not in China for a long period of time, from the mid 50s all the way until 1980. And in 1980, there's two African American musicians, Willie Ruff and Dwight Mitchell, who were at the time the oldest jazz duo in the world. And Willie Ruff says in an interview when China first opened up in the 1980s that cultural groups were sending everybody to China, right? Ballet, American Philharmonic, classical music, and he wanted to take jazz to China. And so he raised money, he learned how to speak Chinese, and he spent 6 months learning Chinese so he can communicate with people about jazz in Chinese, which he did. It was very admirable for him to do that. And they had a master session at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music. And there's a video online where you can see them basically playing jazz. And one of the things that the students were really interested in was this idea of improvisation, that you could improvise to any song that you hadn't heard before. And so Willie Ruff and Dwight Mitchell, they basically proved it to them. They said, let's have a Chinese student play a song we've never heard before, play it, we'll play it back, and then we'll improvise over it. And they did that. And the students were amazed. Again, this video is online, so you can see it. But to improvise, it takes a lot of skill. You just don't play notes. You have to understand scale patterns. You have to be able to play all these things in all 12 major keys, minor keys, the other scales that they have. So it takes a lot of work to be able to improvise at a very high level. And that was what really interested students in jazz. But it took a long time even then for jazz to sort of take hold in China again. So in the 1990s, you have some young musicians like Cui Jian, and they're playing with some American musicians who are there just having jam sessions in the 1990s. And they're learning, starting to relearn the music, right? But if we fast forward to like 2000, I believe Wynton Marsalis came to China with his Lincoln Center Orchestra. Kenny Garrett also spent some time in China, and he was inspired and influenced by Chinese sounds. And he created an album called The Great Wall or Around the Great Wall or something like that, where he was sort of reflecting back to Chinese people what his experience with Chinese music, right? Then you have a young trumpet player named Theo Croker, who's actually a Grammy-nominated trumpet player who actually lived in Shanghai for several years, I think back in 2006, 2007 for a few years, and he still comes back and forth in China. So you do have several musicians who are still playing, in that venue, right? And that helps bring new, fresh ideas of jazz, into the jazz community that's in Shanghai. And when I was in Shanghai in 2018, I was just amazed by the scene because every night at Jay-Z Club, it was packed in different audiences, right? I mean, it's hard to find that in the US right now where you can go into a jazz club and it's going to be packed, if you can find a jazz club, right? But in Shanghai, I mean, every night I went, on weeknight, it's just packed with people. So that was really refreshing to see.
How was jazz perceived in China in the 1980s once China started opening up to the world?
Jazz would have been completely foreign for some of the younger people, right? But for some of the older people who still had memories of this going back to like the 40s, even the early 50s, they would have remembered, this music, right? Even though it was illegal to play in China during that period where they were closed off, I would imagine some people probably still snuck and played something or heard something, even if they were probably part of the elite. But in the 80s, it would be something completely, no pun intended, foreign to the average young person. It would be something new. One historian, David Moser, who's lived in China because he was in Beijing at this time, and he told me that he felt that jazz was somehow seen as being kind of subversive in a way. This was something else, another form of expression that was also tinged with freedom, but was kind of under the radar as opposed to rock and roll.
What were people-to-people interactions like between Black artists and Chinese locals?
If we're going back to the 20s and 30s, I believe that the African American musicians, I mean, had a good time in China. They were making a lot more money than they could make in the U.S., and this was during the Great Depression, right? So they were making a substantial amount of money that provided a certain kind of lifestyle, where they were having their clothes tailored, eating the best food. I mean, yes, they were in Shanghai, and Shanghai was a semi-colonial space where there was still this rigid sort of racial hierarchy that was there, but they were still, because of their income, because of the international aspect of Shanghai. I think most of them really felt free. There was one musician, Teddy Weatherford. He was interviewed, and one person asked him, Teddy Weatherford was this, very tall man for the period. He was like 6'1", 6'2". He used to wear these white suits, donning a white hat. So he was, you couldn't miss him, and he was very like dark-skinned Black man. And so one interviewer purportedly asked him, well, how are you treated? How are things life in Asia? And his response was, they treat us white folks just fine. That had to be how good it was to be a jazz musician in Shanghai at that time, that he would make a statement like that. Even up until the start of World War II in China in 1937, I mean, half the musicians went home because they sort of saw the writing on the wall that, things were becoming more violent. The Japanese bombed part of Shanghai, and some of the musicians left. But there were several African American musicians who did not leave. Uh, they did not leave Shanghai. They stayed, and many of them ended up in like Japanese internment camps. But the fact that they were more willing to deal with the prospects of war than to go back to America says a lot about what America was like then, right? And a lot about, the environment in China. So there's not much in the archive about one-to-one relationships with Chinese and African American artists. We do have information about like Japanese artists and Japanese people and Europeans intermingling, and we have pictures, of them hanging out together and things like that. We don't see the Chinese, and that may have something to do with language barrier. It may have something to do as well with a tinge of maybe some anti-Blackness, and who wants to get to know or befriend Black people. For the common person, I mean, one of the musicians, Buck Clayton, writes very warmly about Chinese people and his interaction with Chinese people, and the experience they had in China. But I can't say that I've seen evidence that there were like strong relationships in the same way that there were strong relationships between African Americans and Filipino musicians or Russian musicians or Japanese musicians, right? They were listening, but were they becoming, bandmates and friends with the African American musicians? There's no evidence that shows that at this particular point, right? 80s and the 90s. I think musicians in general are treated, because of their special talent, are treated a certain kind of way, right, by popular society, right? But there is some unevenness when it comes to how regular, everyday, ordinary, like Black people are treated in China versus other groups of people, like, white students. So in China, there were sort of anti-Black riots in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. I mean, 4 months before Tiananmen Square, before Chinese students were talking about democracy and science and freedom, in Nanjing and other parts of the country, they were saying, Black students should go home. There's something else there, right? And I'm still researching this and trying to sort of peg down the beginning and this sort of like bias towards Blackness. And when I say Blackness, I mean sort of a darker skin tone, right? And in some ways that white students don't have that same experience yet. Yes, they're a foreigner. Yes, they're considered non-Chinese, but the tropes surrounding whiteness are very different than the tropes that the Chinese have in general for Black people. And again, these things are shifting and changing in the 21st century as a lot of Chinese students who have studied in America have, Black teachers and Black friends. But if you would talk to their parents, it'll probably be a different story, right? But these things are still present, right? These things are still present in China, and it does have an impact on Black students who go there. I got to see myself not just as a Black man in America, but just as a young man in the world, in China. When you're somewhere else, you can reinvent yourself. You can experience who you are by yourself.
How did studying abroad in China influence you?
I first studied in China in Beijing in 1997. I was the only Black student in my program. I went on, it was CET academic programs, and I was one Black student, only Black student, a class of like, there were probably 50 students. That was not jarring. I mean, I was prepared for that. I was prepared for that experience in a sense. But I didn't know what to expect. Like, I had had one semester of Chinese before that. So my Chinese wasn't good. I could say hello, goodbye. I could probably mumble my way through ordering food and trying to buy something in the shop. But my Chinese level at that time was really low. And until the end of the semester, it got, of course, a lot better. But my experience, I felt a number of different things, right? One, there was definitely a curiosity from Chinese people towards, my body, towards my Blackness rather. And I didn't feel that it was virulent or that threatening at any point. It was kind of an innocuous like curiosity about who I was, where I was from. People had a hard time imagining that I was from America. It was like, no, you're Black. You got to be from Africa, right? So this was a thing. I would go out to like stores and the shopping malls. And when I would go out to a big store, inevitably large crowds would like form around me. And people were curious. And again, it never felt threatening. It never felt like someone was out to get me or hated me. But there were experiences where I felt like, okay, the experience of, a white American and a Black American are definitely different in China. Ostensibly, it looks the same because people are kind of reacting to you the same way. Oh, they're trying to touch your hair because it's blonde, or they're trying to touch your hair because it's you're Black, and it's some of those outside things are the same. But what I really understood later, towards the end of my stay, was that the difference was internal. There's an internalization of the difference between Black and white. I had maybe 3 really good Chinese friends during my stay there, that who were really interested in me, really sweet, kind people, right? That was definitely ingratiating. I had a really good time with that and enjoyed that and loved them for that. But I don't think that many people were as endearing or wanting to get to know me in the same way that they wanted to get to know my white classmates, right? I mean, it was almost a default, was like, oh yeah, we're trying to get to know white people. And that was because, white Americans were seen as, again, educated or coming from educated families or having money. I mean, again, this is 1997 in China, right? There was a different sort of expectation or a different kind of thought process or tropes that they had for like whiteness. But as a Black person, I would always get these questions about my life and, and poverty and all these other tropes about Blackness that pop up, right? And I'm there and I'm trying to communicate the best I can, but I'm realizing like, they have a very skewed opinion of Blackness, right? And who I am and what I can do, what I can't do, my intellectual capacity and all these other things and your family life and if we have money or not. That took me back a bit. I was a little bit jarred by that. So I did notice that I did have as much, I'd say, opportunity to really meet people or people to really meet me in the same way that some of my white colleagues did, right? And also being on study abroad with majority like white students, no one ever invited me to go to stuff, right? I had to really work hard to like inject myself in like activities and stuff, but no one ever said, hey, Marquitas, let's go. I mean, I hung out with international students. I had like three really good Russian friends, Italian students. I was hanging out with people, other than Americans, because the Americans, I mean, nobody was inviting me to go places and travel and stuff like that. And so I felt in some ways a little isolated, right? And then gaslighted about my experience, right? And things that I was going through. There was this one experience I had. I was with a Chinese American friend and we were out shopping and she had to get a pair of glasses. So we went to this eyeglass store, and she was being fitted for glasses and things like that. So she had to go to a different room, and the guy behind the counter made a comment and she just burst out laughing. And I was like, what's so funny? And she said, oh, this man just said, is your thing following us? He referred to me as a thing. And I was upset with her for laughing, right? And I was like, hey, that's not cool, That really stuck with me, right? That was a form of otherization, right? Things like that would happen, right? Or I had a friend of a friend, Chinese friend of a friend, who referred to me as little black or xiaohei, which can have several different meanings, right? One, I was a very small person. I was 160 pounds, 5'10" when I was in college. So I was super skinny. So, I mean, Xiaohei could be a term of endearment if I knew you, maybe, but it had some other more pejorative meanings that I wasn't quite comfortable with, that I learned, later on. So I started realizing, understanding that, oh, okay, there is a difference with Blackness and whiteness. There is a certain privilege that comes with whiteness, in China. And that may be receding now, right? But there was definitely, when I was there was a, in the preceding years, because I lived in China for, for almost 12 years, right? 12, 13 years. And so, yes, there was this white privilege. And this is not to say that every Chinese person believes in, adheres to, follows like this anti-Blackness, but everyone understands it, right? Everyone knows that it exists, right? And so I've had several experiences when I was there. It was like, whoa, that was pretty shocking, right? But I've also had wonderful friendships, work relationships with many Chinese people who, I didn't feel that way. And so, yeah, but it is there. It's definitely there. My brother told me this one story when he was working for an English company in Beijing. And part of the assignment for the day was, if you could be anyone else in the world, who would you be? And so everyone in the classroom was saying, I want to be this person, this person, this person. Some of them were Chinese, some of them were like famous white people. And then there was one guy who said, I would want to be Michael Jordan. And the class was like, huh? What? But he's black, why would you want to like be black? So there was this sort of like group acknowledgement of Blackness, and it was something that they didn't want to be, right? There is this difference, even today, that we have to acknowledge. It's a little bit disconcerting and disingenuous that the Chinese government officially says that racism doesn't exist in China, because that's not true. And I would love for them to start to just to deal with their own biases, if you want to call it racism, I can call it that, towards like darker skinned people within that country, because it's there, right? It's there. I don't think it should deter students from going, because you experience that here in America, right? But I think that it's something that needs to be worked on, resolved, addressed, in the same way that we're still trying to work on, our problems with race relations in this country, right? There is no panacea, but it's something that we have to engage with, right?
What makes study abroad a valuable experience?
Study abroad is crucial because we have to have one-to-one contacts between people of various different groups and culture, right? That's the only way to move forward, right? We have to really get to know and understand who we are individually, as a group, as a culture, as a people, and it can only really happen. I mean, there's sort of educational things that you can do at universities, at high schools, at elementary schools. But I think the key is really getting people together to see that they have more in common than the things that they differ on, right? So study abroad helps with this, right? It really helps once you're out of your own country. And for me, what it did for me was that it allowed me to see myself out of my own cultural milieu. I was out of my own environment, and I got to see myself not just as a Black man in America, but just as a young man in the world, in China, without the interference of the racial hierarchy, the racial dynamics, and all of the static that you have to deal with on a quotidian basis when you're living in your own country. When you're somewhere else, nobody knows you. You can reinvent yourself. You have time to breathe and experience who you are by yourself. And that's very rewarding and refreshing. And that's what happens with study abroad. I mean, it's an elixir. I mean, I wasn't a great student in undergrad, my initial 2-3 years, but when I got back from study abroad, it seemed that everything had clicked for me. I realized why I was doing this. I had so much more energy and excitement about my classes and about what I was doing and my purpose in life. It just rejuvenated me and energized me. I became a better student that second half of my undergraduate career that helped propel me, to the master's degree, to the PhD, right? I do credit study abroad with that, right? So I recommend that all students have a study abroad experience, even if it's just for the summer. But if you can get a semester program, go on a semester program, that will be life-changing, especially for students who are first generation college students, right? I was a first gen student, undergrad, and that was life-changing for me.
How can institutions encourage study abroad for American students of diverse backgrounds?
There needs to be a lot more money allocated to study abroad, right? I thought the 100,000 Strong Project was a good initiative, uh, but there was no money behind it. So for first gen students, they need money not only for the program to study abroad, and while they're there in the country, they may even need a little bit of money for when they get back, right? Because they're probably working a part-time job, paying rent, taking care of themselves. They're going to need some, like, what do I do when I get home? I'm going to have some money to cushion me until I get my next check, right? Or until school starts back again and work study. So there are all these hidden costs with study abroad for first gen students that need to be addressed. And then another thing is that representation is important. There's one organization now, Student Teens of Color Abroad. That's a person of color is actually running that organization and taking high school students to different countries, right? And that's commendable. We need 10, 20 more of those, right? In doing this, it doesn't mean that that's anathema to what study abroad is about, broadening horizons, getting people around different cultural groups. There is a need for the HBCU. There is a need for the Hispanic Serving Institution. This doesn't mean that the students who attend HBCUs or Hispanic Serving Institutions are somehow cloistered or themselves away from other people or segregating themselves from other people. It's actually the exact opposite. It's that they need a specific space to thrive in to be able to do some of these things, to get their feet wet. And then they can go out there into the world and relate with anyone and be just as good and to deal with anyone, engage with anyone in the world. We need to look at those institutions and those students who, they may not have a 3.5 or a 3.8 GPA. They may be borderline 3.0, 2.8, 2.7, whatever. But those students still deserve a chance and an opportunity. They're still very deserving. And I would argue that an experience like study abroad will help put things in perspective for them and propel them to be not just better students, but more globally minded citizens, right? And lastly, I just say that, we need government, we need private enterprises to, donate and give money to this endeavor. And it's not just a personal for a personal reasons, but it's also national security stuff. There are a number of reasons why we want our citizens to be more globally minded, to have linguistic skills that, not only serve our country, but can be used to help, maintain peace, throughout the world, right? We need that.
Jinping is the political leader of China. Among all the positions he's holding, he's probably holding dozens of positions right now, but there are three that are the most important. First, he's the president of China. This means that he's the head of the state. He gets to meet with other heads of state, for example, Queen Elizabeth or the president of the United States. But in China, this is a symbolic position, which doesn't come with a lot of power. Second, he's the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. This means that he's the boss of the party. This is more powerful than, for example, his counterpart in the US, which, for example, is the chair of the Republican National Committee, which doesn't have a lot of power. But in China, if you are the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, you get to make decisions not only for the party, but also for the whole country. The third position, which is the most powerful among all, is the chairman of the Central Military Affairs Commission. This means that he's the commander-in-chief in China, who is in charge of China's military.
It's very fashionable to talk about de-risking these days, but there is a process by which some of the larger companies are kind of separating their China business from the rest of the world, and this is concerning. And it's happening as a result of a lot of different factors. One of which is lessons that came out of COVID, but part of it also is the U.S.-driven so-called decoupling measures and security measures. It's also coming from the China side. And this is something that I've raised often with the Chinese government is, let's not pretend that it's only the US driving decoupling. It's, China's doing the same thing. And this data protection law is one example. And the data protection law makes it very difficult for multinational companies to operate in the way that they're accustomed to, meaning operating across borders.
What is BRICS? And how does it compare to other global groups such as NATO, the EU, and ASEAN?
You can think of BRICS as a group of countries, not so much an alliance or a trade union or an economic union like the ASEAN or EU or NATO might be. BRICS is simply a collection of emerging global economies from the global south who think that their economic clout and the size of their economies is growing to the extent that they can be a power broker or a player on the global scene. And this is an attempt by these countries to try and come together and rethink or push back on the rules of the road as far as the global system is concerned. It was initially started by Brazil, India, China, and Russia. And then later on, South Africa was added. So the S is for the South Africa. In just this year, they have added 6 more members, 3 countries from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, 1 country from Latin America, Argentina, and then 2 countries from Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And so with this addition, people are now starting to call this BRICS Plus. And it is to be seen how the addition of these new members will change the scope of their engagements. I should also add that China is definitely one of the leading powers behind BRICS, but it is not the sole motivator of all activities that BRICS undertakes. We did notice that unlike the G20 summit that was recently had in India, where President Xi did not go in person, instead chose to send his premier, at the BRICS summit, he has always shown up and tried to show China's leadership. And we have learned that the addition of these new members and the idea of expanding BRICS to BRICS Plus was actually that of China. And the Chinese will see this as a major win, as the total size of the GDP from these 11 BRICS Plus members is now pretty sizable.
How will BRICS coordination and cooperation impact the US?
I think in the short term, we do not see much substantive effect on an average American's life or even the American economy. I think this is at the moment more signaling than it is substance. The BRICS did, for example, have at one point this idea of coming up with a singular currency, and there were also conversations around coming up with their own payment system so that there is less reliance on the US dollar and the SWIFT payment system, so that these countries can avoid future US sanctions, which of course is one of the big tools of power that the US still holds. Having said that, both of those initiatives have actually failed. These countries still have a lot of differences among themselves. And it looks to me from recent developments that most of the focus on BRICS will be on economic integration, trade, and trying to work together more and more on economic cooperation amongst themselves, rather than trying to assert themselves at the global stage. The BRICS had also at one point started the BRICS Bank, which is supposed to be like the World Bank, a multilateral bank. And that has also had problems in taking off. It has been in operations now for a few years. Its loan size or its portfolio is growing, but it is still nowhere near some of its big competitors in Washington, or even in other capitals like the World Bank or Asian Development Bank in Manila.
How will this expansion of BRICS impact China's relationship with the global South?
After completing 10 years of the BRI, China has recently launched a series of global initiatives without much specifics on budgets and initiative details. They've done this for a global security initiative, for a global cultural and civilization initiative, and a global development initiative. All of these are intended to essentially question the rules-based world order, which the US and its allies had created and have maintained over the last several decades. I think the expansion of BRICS into these new countries, especially the inclusion of countries from Africa and Latin America, is basically going to signal to the world and to countries in the global South that China is in the process now with practical steps to rebuild the rules of the road as it comes to the global system, and that all the grievances that developing countries have had from institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, which they often blame for many of their ills, that narrative is going to be supported by a big global power now showing up and saying, we are trying to build an alternative system, come in our ambit and we will walk you through that and see what the world looks like. But having said that, I think, again, in the short term, the bulk of China's substantive engagements with the global South will still be through the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives which involve actual dollars and funds and construction capacity. Most of these initiatives, including the BRICS, I think at the moment are more talk than they are action.
Can you share a little bit about how China's engagement with BRICS has changed over the past 14 years?
That's a great point. The concept of BRICS, or this acronym, was actually coined by economists in the West, in New York, who were looking at the world as analysts of the future of the economy. And they picked these countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as the emerging powers of the world. And their assertion essentially was that by 2050, these countries will be the leading economies, and we will be working a lot with them on different kinds of economic investments and initiatives and so on. So that's essentially where the concept started. And in the early days, BRICS was more like an investment club where these countries were coming together, sharing best practices and presenting their best foot forward as a group to Western capital and saying that we are attractive destinations for investments. All of that changed by around 2009, 2010. This is around the time when China, after the global financial crisis, was pulling its dollars from US treasuries and moving them to developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. Even if the BRI was not formally announced at that time, we saw the biggest increases in China's outward development financing in the years 2009, 10, and 11. This is also the time when South Africa was included in this club. And so that's when it really became a block of countries or a group of countries. And then in 2014, they decided to make it even more formal by introducing the idea of a new development bank. And since then, every year we are seeing new initiatives. And I think the 2023 summit that we just saw in September of this year will be the coming of a new era in the evolution of BRICS, because it has certainly gone from being a group of these 5 emerging economies into something much larger with bigger ambitions. And all you have to do is read the transcript of the speech that President Xi of China made and on this summit, and it is very clear that they are looking at this as a tool to compete against the United States and to put a face against what they consider as hegemony of the United States on the global system.